I'm doing well. It's a bit of a cooler day today, which is a little nice. I like the heat. I know I'm weird, but it was way too hot the last few days. Global warming, am I right? I guess I should be saying, oh, how can global warming be real when it was cooler today than it was yesterday? That's the line, right? That's how you make the argument. As always, because it's a little bit cooler, I did want to make sure I had tea today. Take advantage of when it's not quite so hot. And normally I don't like to have the same kind of tea multiple days in a row, but I was so interested in trying to get the lemon balance right. If you remember yesterday, we tried Earl Grey tea with lemon, and I put too much, but I put less this time. Hopefully it'll be all right. Hopefully it'll be good. I imagine it will be. I was enjoying it. It was just like noticeably too much lemon. It wasn't like too sour. It was just kind of an overpowering the taste. It didn't get much of the tea, so this should be good. And maybe going forward, Earl Grey will be with lemon for me. I guess we'll engage in that Brittery and offset it by engaging in a wonderful American pastime, which is getting mad at the British. So, as I understand, Richard Dawkins, famed thinker, has well, his thinkery is not going great. Um, for those of you who don't know, Richard Dawkins is, well, I mean, I imagine you do know. It's hard to imagine the people who haven't heard of him. But just in case, a famous atheist thinker of, well, I mean, he rose to notoriety in like early 2000s in this group called the New Atheists, who even describe themselves like only being new as in being recent. They didn't really describe themselves as being fundamentally different than atheists of the past, so much as just we're here now and we're open and talking about it. This group included Christopher Hitchens, who we had watched and read in the past on this stream, but also Daniel Dennett, who, from what I've seen, doesn't do that much talking about this stuff. He seems more interested in, I think he's a biologist. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. And Sam Harris, who, well, has fallen down the Joe Rogan rabbit hole, for lack of a better term. So I guess following in that grand tradition of having some severely right-wing takes like Hitchens and Harris before him, Dawkins, who, well, I'll come back to some of his notables, is apparently siding with his compatriots in British celebrity by being anti-trans. And so we'll be watching a podcast of his with Helen Joyce, a person who we'll look into before we start on that. Notable things from Dawkins' past is he wrote The God Delusion, a book that was known for being rather inflammatory. I might have listened to the audiobook, but it's so long ago I don't remember. I might as well not have at this point. He was mostly criticized for being far too aggressive. He and Lawrence Krauss got along kind of on that axis. Whether or not they were, it's kind of up for debate. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But I also understand where they were coming from a lot of the time, and a lot of time what was being considered inflammatory was just being like, oh yeah, evolution's real, to evangelicals that believe in creationism. That's not being inflammatory or rude or whatever just because you get offended that someone's letting you know that you share a common ancestor with apes who you think you're better than. So, uh, Dawkins already has this kind of history of coming off as uh, abrasive. So it's not like that weird. You might have also seen him being made fun of on South Park, one of the many things South Park did very poorly, which was to denigrate someone who is already in a position of being attacked for just basically like thinking what he thinks. Remember that while like the angry atheist trope is a thing that we have in our minds, that mostly comes from the last 20 years or so, and atheists are not particularly treated well across the world, let alone in this country. There's a lot of discussion of like maybe there were a lot of people in the past who simply did not discuss their atheism because they knew they wouldn't be treated well. Things like laws against apostasy with a lot of religions are a thing. So like, yeah, I didn't love how even like when I disagree with Dawkins to be like, oh, this like stupid atheist, like look how ridiculous he is. It's just one of those like pretending to punch at everyone like South Park would, when in actuality you're mostly just attacking the marginalized. Now again, atheism is a minor marginalization when compared to things like race or sexual orientation or being trans, bringing it back today. But it is an axis of marginalization, and well, I just wanted to get that off my chest because South Park has long bothered me for that kind of behavior. In any case, to the issue at hand, he's in conversation with Helen Joyce, a name who that sounds familiar to me, and I had forgotten to look up until just now. So let's take a look. Who is this Helen Joyce person? Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, she's a turf. I was pretty sure she had been in conversation with J.K. Rowling before. I was just double checking the name, but yeah, current director of advocacy for campaign group Sex Matters. Obviously, oh, interesting that it's linked, but still under construction, I guess. The name should be telling enough. This is a common turf line that trans people or like here look trans when all ideology meets reality. There seems to be it's the Bont and Bailey that they often do where they'll say like really inflammatory shit about trans people and then be like, we're just saying that sex matters or that sex is real. Nobody disagrees that sex is real. Trans people, in fact, notably very aware of the reality of their sex. That's why there are a lot of trans people with interest in hormone therapy and medical transition because they want to diminish the amount that sex impacts how they look and their hormonal balance and so on and so forth. This is obviously not. Nobody argues that sex doesn't matter or sex isn't real, but it is often people often pretend like that is. That should be enough. I mean, obviously, right? Just knowing about this, that advocacy group, this book name, yes. So in conversation with the turf, let's see what they have to say. The Poetry of Reality. I'm not familiar with it. I think this is his podcast, so we might not have much to look at here. But
Welcome to
oh no,
the
okay,
Poetry
they do
of
actually
Reality.
have the thing.
I don't have a religion, but I think if I had one, it would be the religion of reality. And it's a pleasure to
I
meet
hate that
Helen
he says
Joyce.
that's
Yes, I
that's an
haven't met her
often
before. I
accusation.
wanted to
Oh
meet
my
her.
god, Dawkins, you should know better than to say that. The religious will often say like, "Oh, you believe in evolutionism. That's your that's your religion," or atheism is your religion, which he knows because he's argued with theists who have accused him of just that. We've even seen it on our stream. But now he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm the religion of reality." Like, oh my god, you should know better.
Since reading her wonderful book, Trans, where
Oh, he considers it a
ideology
wonderful
meets
book. Phenomenal.
reality.
Yeah.
Uh,
The
Science
transness
is all about
is going to
reality,
be thorough.
and science and
One thing that's going to be
reality have
noteworthy about this
come up against
conversation is
some
that there's not going to be a dissenting voice.
competition,
It's
some
only going to be
opposition,
us. They're going to be in
and Helen has
agreement
been in the forefront of
about turf
uh,
shit. So
fighting against some of this
don't expect
opposition.
any pushback,
Um,
except for
there's
me,
a
I guess.
character in a Kingsley Amis novel, I think, who gets interviewed on television, and the interviewer tells him who he is and what he does and how long he's done it. So that's a typical trope of television to tell the interviewee about herself. But I'm going to ask Helen to introduce herself very briefly.
Thank you.
Let's see
Thank you
what
so much
she
for
wants
having me
to
on.
introduce about herself.
Well, I work for an advocacy organisation called Sex Matters now, but my background has been rather varied. So when I was a little girl, I wanted to be a dancer, and I actually went off to dance school when I left school at 16. And after 2 years, realised that wasn't a great idea and went and did a degree in maths. in Trinity College Dublin, and I stayed and did my master's in Cambridge and my PhD in maths at UCL in London, and then spent 3 years doing postdoc in mathematics before changing course and going into public understanding of maths and science.
So as a note
And then
about
in
that,
2000,
like remember, notice that she's not studied in any related fields to this discussion, right? She's not a sociologist, she's not a biologist, she's not a philosopher, she's a mathematician. I hadn't known about some of this stuff, but yeah, and it's also kind of noteworthy, like, given this history in mathematics and science popularizing and things like that, now her whole career is about anti-trans stuff. This is something that's been noted by people smarter than me in the past, which is that this tendency for, well, I guess bigots to be so wrapped up in this particular thing that their whole life will be dedicated to it, even though they had a bunch of other stuff going for them, and now all they want to do is talk about basically their bigotry. Um, uh, yeah. I'm just reading some of this. So Glad described Joyce's December 2018 article, "The New Patriarchy: How Trans Radicalism Works Women, Children, and Trans People Themselves." I bet. For Quillette as alarming, stating they have no place in a newsroom. Joyce responded the organization had been co-opted by Anthony Watson to continue his unprovoked attacks against me. Yeah, like, okay. The conspiracism, too.
2005, I joined The Economist as the education correspondent, and I spent 17 years there doing various jobs, along the way living in Brazil as a foreign correspondent, and then becoming an editor of various sections of the paper, including the international and finance sections. And one fateful day in 2017, the editor sat down beside me at lunch and said, "Why do the kids keep coming home and saying such and such is trans?" And I said, "I have no idea. Shall I look into it for you?" And my first attempt to find an author, I found somebody who had been through a lot of queer theory and gender studies at university and managed to write 3 pages about people identifying as male or female, man or woman, without ever mentioning that sex is about reproduction and that the sex is a reproductive role.
Notice, okay, so this is really telling. So this is the first instance she's encountered. She, according to her, this is the first person that she got a hold of to talk about trans stuff. And they went on to talk about gender as identity because gender is not identical to sex. And her complaint is that sex has to do with reproduction, but no one's talking about sex. We're talking about gender. Sex and gender are different things. That's why it's not coming up. And by the way, no, like, sex being about reproduction is like true and not true. It is a mechanism of reproduction, and the sexes are like designed by nature to, I guess I don't even like the word design, have developed in order to be able to reproduce with each other, but also we've discussed a spectrum. You being born a particular sex isn't about reproduction. You'd be, and the reason why I make that point is because you'd be just as justified in saying, therefore you have no right not to reproduce. Right? Sex is about reproduction. You just being born and having a sex, which is about reproduction, means oughtn't you reproduce, and by not doing so, it's a violation of that. It's nonsense.
And that they're evolved categories.
Yeah.
And I had to bend that piece, and I ended up writing it myself. And
by
this time I
realized so she had to bend it, write it herself, being someone who doesn't understand, conflating sex and gender, even from the outset, right? So clearly she had, this isn't, so it appears a bit like she's painting it as, I was just a journalist investigating and I saw the ridiculousness, but she went in with her own views, not looking to learn about what's going on or what the position is, so much as to hear it go, well, that doesn't conform with how I look at the world. You must be wrong and you must be ridiculous, and it's impossible that I don't have it's impossible that I have an incomplete understanding of this idea.
That there was a lot of very odd stuff happening here. And that turned into my book, which came out in 2021.
It is a very odd phenomenon because I'm used to continua wherever I look. I mean, there's tall versus short, fat versus thin, old
so yeah,
versus young.
that's a really important. And Dawkins, if I'm not mistaken, is a biologist. So yeah, it's very important to note there are continuum everywhere. continua, I suppose, in nature. Nature doesn't operate in binaries, yet there's this insistence that sex is one. It maps perfectly onto every human, that you are either male or female, there is no ambiguity, and that your gender is identical to that, which is nonsense. Nature doesn't work that way. Sex is not a binary, it's bimodal, and that sex and gender are different is very important, socially speaking. There's no reason why it needs to be imposed, because again, like, if you're going to say it's biologically written, that's another thing. Remembering that gender has expectations attached to it, and gender role, like, what we mean by gender is entirely social. You would have to argue that biologically it is incorrect. Like, it would be a violation of biology for a woman to wear pants. Like, you basically have to say something to that effect. It's biologically necessary that women are barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen or whatever. But obviously, no. These two people are almost certainly not going to take that position, and I would agree with them in that regard. But it's just as associated to biology as any other gendered behavior, I suppose, including opting out of the gender you were assigned at birth.
Things are a smooth continuum. The one thing that isn't is sex. I mean, sex really is binary.
No, it's not. Wait, what the hell?
Or female, and it's
you should know better.
Clear. You could do it on gamete size.
The obvious evidence for this is intersex people exist. If it's binary, literally no other options can be the case. But there are intersex people. He's just factually wrong, and I don't understand how he can make a mistake like this.
And do it on chromosomes. And so it is, to me, as a biologist, distinctly weird that people can simply declare, I am a woman.
Which is a gendered statement, and not a sex statement.
That seems to me to be a strange distortion of language, because
it's strange if you don't understand it, yeah.
Useful as something to express your thoughts clearly. And so I'm bewildered by it. And
can you please increase the audio level of the Dawkins video?
I learned a tremendous lot from it. While I'm about it, I could recommend a couple of other books. Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier.
Just absolute
about the
piece of trash literature
on young girls and how they get.
It's interesting. It's telling that he's repping that book because hold on, let me go back to
particularly focusing on
Irreversible Damage. This book has been noted as like one of the most blatant, bigoted works of writing ever written. Like, it's not subtle at all. It talks about trans people as like a contagion and like a blight, if I'm not mistaken. And so it's kind of telling that he's repping this as like, oh, it's such a great book, this openly bigoted piece of trash.
About the particularly focusing on young girls and how they get misled. And this one, Material Girls by Kathleen Stock.
I've never heard of.
Listened to this on audio, so I don't have a physical copy of the book, so I printed out the cover of it. Helen, what do you think lies behind this odd distortion of reality?
So now, we're assuming there's a distortion. Remember, this is the problem with not having a dissenting voice in the room. They get to act like, yeah, what trans people say is that sex isn't real, and also we can sex and gender are the same thing, and I can change both of them. That's not what the claims are. And so it's like, oh, you're just denying reality? Yes, they are just denying reality. Let's agree on that and ask why. It's going to be difficult.
So that was basically the question that got me into this in the first place. And I mean, I've been thinking really almost full time about this for about 5 years now, and I don't have a pat answer for you. I think, like a lot of interesting.
It's pretty telling, isn't it?
It's a lot of things.
Maybe you fundamentally misunderstand the issue.
I would say that when I started to write about it first, I quickly realised that this wasn't treated the same way as anything else. Like, just asking very obvious questions, like, don't you think that if we allow people to self-identify their sex, this will lead to, for example, destroying women's sports or putting... So notice how the question is, don't you think that slippery slope argument? Like, this is the same thing that people did for, like, abolition of slavery, right? Or with gay marriage, right? People will say, well, don't you think if we allow gay people to marry that the next thing is people will marry their dogs?
it's obviously nonsense. But also the question of like destroying women's sports. First of all, no, not necessarily. Um, for one, most people don't give a shit about women's sports. Let's be real. For two, um, trans people have been allowed to compete in the Olympics for more than 20 years and have never, not once, not a single time, won a medal. Not once, ever. So it seems like kind of a non-issue. Now, there's a lot of fear mongering about like, what if, like, a man is super buff and muscular and then transitions. It just says he's a woman so he can win events, but this doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. Obviously, turfs get mad anytime a trans person does well in a sport, but also what there's like a lot of nuance to this that gets left on the table. I recommend you to a video by Mia Mulder that's really interesting about talking about gendered sports, which might there might be an issue to the concept of gender dividing sports in the first place, just for the simple fact that like the well, one, trans people exist, and so what category they go into up for debate, but also like how do I put this? There are some events where it doesn't really make any sense. For example, shooting, and I don't mean archery, I mean like with a gun. Why should those competitions be gender segregated? There's no real reason, right? And a lot of what we expect out of sports ends up being a determination of who's biologically better at doing this thing. People have spent a lot of time talking about Michael Phelps having an abnormally large wingspan for his height even. And that's a biological difference that leads to him having an advantage in the sport. Not to mention the fact that with puberty blockers, the kind of thing turfs are super opposed to, and the ability for trans kids to avoid the wrong puberty, trans people can very often be biologically indistinguishable in terms of like athletic ability from cis people. So what's the problem? But maybe there needs to be more of an address to this, because just because I'm in the same sex as other men who compete, I'm not going to be as good as those people. That's maybe there should be divisions based on skill level or whatever else, which we have in a lot of things. And at that point, there's no reason why I couldn't compete against a woman. Lots of women are better at me than most sports. That's not weird. There's a lot of nuance here, but she's wrapping it all up of like, well, I can't get a simple answer to this highly loaded, charged question that doesn't have a good answer, and ignores the problems that already exist.
Rapists in women's jail.
Oh, and by the way, some of the like gender segregation that's been done on this, like, oh, well, we got to make sure the transes don't think we'll do testosterone checks for our competitors. Well, what happens when there's a cisgender woman who just has an unusually high testosterone level because that's how her biology is? That's happened, by the way. That's been an issue in competitive sporting events. These aren't clear answers, and she's noting, well, I haven't gotten a clear answer to this insoluble problem, so isn't that telling? Like, no, it's not.
Jails, people would turn this back on me and say, you think that trans people are predators, or you think...
Well, okay, so she does think that, but that will be a response to a different statement different kind of statement that she'll make. TERFs definitely think that trans women are predators, and we'll get to that. It will almost certainly come up.
Trans people are in bad faith, you're a bigot. And I hadn't experienced this before at that point, about 14 years as a journalist.
That's a willful misunderstanding. And
she is willfully misunderstanding them.
And I mean, I slowly became aware that what we were talking about here was an intensely linguistic movement. Like, there isn't a sense in which a man can become a woman, except linguistically.
No, that's not true at all. Well, I mean, I guess you conflate sex and gender, so yeah, I mean, which is also not true. There are degrees to which you can change your sex, because what we mean by sex is it's not as cut and dry as they're pretending it is. It's not this binary on-off switch. But like you can change a lot of your physiology and your biology. You can't change your DNA, but TERFs have long since moved past the DNA thing because they understand that that's a problem for them. But you can change your hormone levels, you can change your genitalia, you can change this, you can change that. At a certain point, aren't you just the other sex? But they wouldn't accept that either, right? Theirs is a ideological opposition, ironic given their topic of discussion, the way they're framing this.
he can have operations, and some people do. Most trans people don't have any operations, don't take any medicine, don't have any genital surgery. But that doesn't change your sex.
Nobody says it does.
The reason the
by
female
way.
eunuch is called that is that Germaine Greer was pointing at the way that the man is seen as the full human and the woman is seen as the lacking human. She is a female eunuch. She's a man that you've castrated. But actually, female people aren't male people lacking something, or male people lacking something with a little grow bag that you pop a baby out of every now and then. Female people are their own category. Female and male are actually very profound categories. They're profound, biological, evolved categories.
So this is someone who has put a lot of personal stake into her womanhood and is kind of offended at the concept that people might opt into it. This is like, you can see it how she's discussing this. It's not like that male and female are very profound categories, are they? I think for a lot of people, they don't actually care that much about their sex or gender. I think for a lot of people, it's just like an aspect of them, and they go about their lives. But for her, it's really meaningful. So she'll say it is very profound, and it's, you can't just join a different group. You can't be a woman. I've had to, be a woman, and that means a lot to me. You can't have it mean the same thing. It feels a lot like when, I don't know if you've had this experience, but if you grew up in like the 80s or 90s, and you were like, oh, I love Led Zeppelin, or I love, I don't know, some like 60s band. I love, or like Simon and Garfunkel or whatever. Like some boomer ass person will be like, well, you don't really love them. Like you're not like a real fan. You're just like 13. You don't know what you're talking about. It's this like feeling. I have a true appreciation of it, and there are aspects of it that are necessary to aspects of my experience that are necessary to be a true fan that you don't have, and you can't have, because otherwise I wouldn't be a true fan in a meaningfully different and better way. This is the kind of approach she's espousing.
Evolutionarily, they have to be. That the gift of giving birth is something that pervades the whole anatomy and physiology and psychology, actually.
Cool, but that giving birth isn't the only thing about womanhood, right? Like, I don't like. Would either of you be comfortable saying, like, if a woman goes through menopause, she's not a real woman anymore, or if a woman gets a hysterectomy or has some injury that prevents her from giving birth, or has her tubes tied, or is simply born without ovaries, as we saw in that Hunter Avalon debate? He mentioned that's a thing that can happen. Like, are you comfortable saying they're not real women? Probably not, right? You'd probably find that really insulting, because women aren't just baby making factories. Well, I agree with that. Why is that the determinative factor when it comes to excluding trans people, though?
Exactly, and if you're a mammal, every part of your body is female. Like, earthworms have both
That's
parts,
not true,
But
by the way.
my hands are female, my jaw is female. It's not just that I have, I'm a man with a uterus popped in. And
So that's not true whatsoever. There are aspects of your biology that are affected by your sex and aspects that are not. By and large, there's a huge amount. Again, we mentioned this previously. The transphobes will act like men and women are different species, and you just can't, like, they're so different. Men and women are, like, males and females are different, but they're not that different. I mean, it's only, there are a few weeks or months in the womb where there's no development yet, or there's no sexual change. They're the exact same materials and the exact same physical structures and the same building blocks, and then hormone washes it's not like this metaphysical through to your bones thing like they're talking about.
no penis. But so it was the only sense in which a man can become a woman or a woman can become a man is by saying so. It's a speech utterance. And so I've come
That's
to
not
see,
entirely true.
I
It's a
think there are many
social
things happening here. There's
statement,
things
but also
happening in
sex and gender are
medicine,
different.
politics. But one of the
But
things
they're gonna
that's
conflate.
happening is a long run, maybe 2 or 3 century move towards seeing categories and classification as inherently oppressive. So people think
There are degrees to that which are accurate, which Dawkins should know, because he should understand that being attached to the label atheist has a lot of social repercussions that are often very negative. and she should know this too, she's a woman. That also has a lot of social repercussions that are often negative. She's old enough where she should have lived through at least second wave feminism to have seen that there's aspects to that affect her life and that can be fought against, even though she's probably opposed to things like third and fourth wave feminism. Um, but first wave feminism, more importantly, like the suffragettes, talking arguing for their right to vote on the basis of this categorization that can be oppressive.
Heteronormative
She should
is a
agree
bad
with
thing.
this.
Or they think that
Oh,
the
you're
traditional family is
pro-heteronormativity.
constraining. And
Oh my God, the traditional family is such a misnomer. The traditional family is less than 100 years old. But okay, sure. You go off, Queen.
It's the point that these things often, like when I say evolved, I don't mean like evolutionary biology. I mean that they came to be over significant amounts of time for a reason, and they're supportive as well as constraining. But everything that's structured or categorized or named or classified, that's now seen as something imposed upon people.
Well, it can often be.
So somebody like Judith Butler, for example, who's the queer theorist who wrote Gender Trouble, which is kind of
And you would probably agree if I called you a TERF to your face, because TERFs get real upset about being correctly named as TERFs.
Text.
They even have shit saying like TERF is a slur, which is not true.
Says that gender is an imitation for which there is no original. That she doesn't see sex. She says sex is socially constructed and gender is the real thing. And
I would tend to disagree with that second part, but I like that description, that gender is an imitation for which there is no original. That seems to map on pretty well to my view of gender, which is that it's a mode of categorization, but one to which there aren't really good descriptors because it's the only one of its kind. But just like you can categorize someone on the basis of religion or profession or hobby, there are lots of these kinds of categorization. This is gender is a mode of categorization, but the thing is, those categories are exceptionally nebulous, and I would agree that they are imitation without original, and are simultaneously define the people in the category and are defined by the people in the category. And when you look at it that way, you realize it's actually not that big a deal to change category. It's just a mode of viewing yourself, a mode of being viewed, things like that. It's no different than like it's like, I don't know. I was gonna say no different, but it's a little different. But it's very, very similar to things like your astrological sign, like what zodiac sign you are. It's made up and nonsense, but there are associated expectations of people from that are defined by observing people, and also making stuff up. And it's not universal. You might say that like it's objectively the case that we can determine what month you were born in, but why should that matter? The Chinese zodiac doesn't care about month; it cares about year.
Foundation for gender. It's just something that's made meaningful by performing it over and over again. Now, I hadn't come across this at university. As I say, I studied mathematics, and I spent my time proving theorems and defining my terms very carefully.
Well,
so
social terms are much harder to define.
The fact that significant numbers of young people are being taught this sort of nonsense. But they
to demonstrate this, I do want to ask people like this, like, okay, define womanhood. Like, what does it mean to act like a woman? What does that mean? You couldn't possibly do it. Nobody can do it. And it's not because it's meaningless. It is in fact very meaningful to a lot of people, but it's just not the kind of it's not the kind of thing that is easy to define because it's a social term with a lot of variance.
Out of it thinking that somebody who says, look, there are two sexes, and the sex that you are is the sex that you were conceived as, they think that what you're doing is imposing social roles on them.
Well, you are, right? Because you're also saying, because like, even if a trans person were to agree with that and just go, oh, okay, well, if that's all it is, then there's no reason why I, who was born a male, couldn't wear a dress and go into a women's bathroom, right? What's actually wrong with that? If it's merely your sex as your physiology at birth, and there's no expectation or roles attached to it. And she's saying, no, you must act like a man because you were born with a penis. You are ascribing these roles.
I was brought up to think that what was liberatory and what was progressive was to say, well, this little person is a girl. Let's not let her stop. Let's not let that stop her doing anything. She could be an astronaut. She could
Well,
be president.
quite. I
Yeah,
mean,
okay, what if one of those things is she wants to be a boy? What if you are actively trying to stop her from doing something?
I think we were all sort of, when I was brought up to think that you could do whatever you wanted to. You have the power to, as you said, be an astronaut, be whatever you damn well like.
I do like
And it's as though,
I do like the lemon in the tea, by the way. I still think I put too much, but not by nearly as much, and it is quite the nice compliment. Just that little bit of citrus and the like lemony flavor. It doesn't get sour. It's very, very good.
this trend
The
now
Brits might be onto
is
something, though not in this
reverting
conversation.
to stereotyped girls like pink and boys like blue and boys like playing with Meccano sets.
Okay, so like at
girls
that
like
point,
playing with
so
dolls
this is what I mean by like all roads lead to gender essentialism, which I guess I haven't said, or sorry, not gender essentialism, it's gender abolition, which I guess I haven't said before. Of like, okay, so you agree that based on your a sex, which you're conflating with gender, you can be and do whatever. It doesn't just because you're born with a vagina doesn't mean that you have to like pink or whatever. Okay, are there any things it should mean about how you have to live your life? They want to say no because obviously to say yes sounds like they're imposing gender roles, which they are. They want to do that. And so if there is literally no impact that it ought to have on your life, the sex you were born as, then there's no reason why that same little girl that he's talking about can grow up and be like, well, I want to wear slacks and I want to like take testosterone, so I'll grow a beard and I want to get a mastectomy because that's what I want to do. Is there any reason why that should be disallowed? Well, they're in essence saying yes. They're saying you should have to not do that. Like you should have to conform to some level of gender expectation. But what they're saying out loud is no. What they're saying is no, you should be able to live however you want to live. And if you want to like wear makeup and also, be a lumberjack and also get like hair transplants so you can grow a beard or whatever, cool. Live your life, enjoy it. I hope it makes you happy. And that you're free to do that is a positive. It's a good thing that freedom exists in the world. Well, what you're describing is gender abolition. What you're describing is like, okay, you have this sex, but that sex has no impact on your life. In effect, you have no gender. You can just be who you want to be, which I think would be good. I'm on board for that. But you should then also not have a problem with trans people because trans people are just doing that. They're simply opting into announcing a category. If they didn't announce that category, would you just be okay with it? If they were just like, sure, whatever, but like my sex at birth should have no difference, make no impact on my life, including, by the way, my pronouns, right? Why should it be that I have to use certain pronouns because I was born as a particular sex? So yeah, I was born with a vagina, but I prefer he, him pronouns, and I'm just going to live my life the way I want to live it. They should have no issue with this based on what they've just said, but they do, because they're not actually gender abolitionists. They're not actually on board for full freedom of gender expression. What they want is for you to have to conform to some level of they understand the category exists. They understand their expectations, and they disagree that a person should be able to violate certain aspects of those expectations based on their sex. Whereas I go the other way and I say, well, as long as these categories exist, we shouldn't use them to harm people. So trans people should be able to identify and express however they want, because they should be able to do that in an even more broad way in a world that has no concept of gender. And I think that would be better. I think most people are a lot closer to non-binary than they'd be comfortable admitting, because all of us have our own interests and things that we like and things that we don't like and things that we'd like to do. And obviously we're post-socialization at the point where, we're able to have this conversation. And so like, it's not in a vacuum. Maybe the things I would have liked would have been different had I been raised differently. Doesn't really matter. I am who I am now. But being able to just do whatever, wouldn't that be good? Like why should it be that the way you were born impacts your life so greatly? And they agree with the sentiment of that question, but disagree in practice.
And it's a stereotyping which I kind of revolt against, and yet it seems to be increasingly fashionable.
Absolutely, and it's worse than just the old-fashioned stereotyping that would have said, look, this child is definitely a boy, and if he doesn't like rugby and so on, well, he's a pufter, and let's bully him. It's now saying he's actually a girl.
But
Yes.
no, you're saying no. Okay. So they're acting like it's being imposed from without. No, trans people, as far as I know, every trans person identifies themselves as trans and is not told they're trans. That's like there's this conspiracism of like this dark cabal of endocrinologists who are like out transing people, to borrow some phrases from ContraPoints, who is brilliant. But no, it's expressed from within, not imposed from without. And you're the one saying that you must conform to some degree of gender expectation, because when they don't, you get mad and say they're a contagion, that they're making up shit about reality and they're delusional and they're not really trans.
So, there's the pink and the blue boxes have been structured and remade and reinforced.
By
and
you.
a child who doesn't fit into the one that's for the sex that they were, inverted commas, assigned at birth, we have to pop them into the other one. And if you call
No,
them
see,
out-
that's the thing. Like, there's, again, this conspiracism. Like, it's happening from outside, that people are being told they're trans. No. Trans people tell other people they're trans. Nobody's transing kids. And we even saw when we read Genderqueer, Maya Kobe, the author, had no idea what being non-binary was. That was just not a thing that he was ever told about, or learned, but had the feelings anyway. It came from within.
on this, they say, no, that's gender expression, that's gender roles you're talking about. We're talking about gender identity, which is a sort of posited, innate knowing that you pop into the world with.
No
Nobody
no
pops
one
into
says
the
it.
world
It's not,
knowing
you're not popped into the world with. As I understand it, it's pretty early in life that people have like a sense of gender, and like as early as like 3 to 5, people will start to show signs that they're trans. It's not, but not before. It's not popped into the world with, and it's not innate. And who what does it matter if it's innate or not? Like, people always ask, like people sometimes mock trans people by being like, oh, what gender am I today? What difference would it make if it were that frivolous? Who cares? For real, who cares?
that sort of thing about themselves. Children learn it from the stereotypes. They self-examine and match themselves against the stereotypes.
Yeah, which
So now-
exists in the world, and in a gender abolished society, I imagine that there wouldn't be quite so many trans people, because people would just be able to do and be whoever they want, and there wouldn't be as much of an interest in transitioning in order to be viewed differently, because you could just be viewed the way you want it to be. Now, there would probably be some people who still have body dysphoria or dysmorphia or whatever, and or even just like the idea of looking different, and that's fine. They should be allowed to do that. That's okay. Nobody gets this up in arms when a cis woman wants to get breast implants, but if a trans woman does it, they start getting upset about it. Which I understand they don't do all that much. As I understand, feminizing hormones will allow your body to just grow a breast naturally. And if that's what you want to do, like, who cares? Why would that be a problem? Yeah, I don't know. I've kind of lost the plot of where I was going with this. It's just so many things. It's just like wrong in ways that compound on previous ways of being wrong.
we say to little...
Ooh, this one's going to be rough.
What you used to call a sissy boy, that little boy now thinks that he's meant to be a girl.
That's also
And
not
teachers may say
true.
that's not what I'm telling him,
As
but
I
it is
understand
what
it, gay men are not particularly likely to be trans, but maybe I'm mistaken. I don't know.
Yes, I was
It wouldn't
very
matter if that were the case,
upset
by the
to
way.
see
And they're not being
evidence from
told they're
your book and
trans,
others
they're
that
telling other people they're trans.
teachers and doctors perhaps are latching on to a child who expresses the slightest
See, yeah,
doubt
they're
about
just
this,
talking
and
about this
then
conspiracism of like,
affirms
oh,
them
you
as
express some
being,
sort of this, and and it's
opposite
kind of funny because,
gender.
okay, so what they're talking about right now is like this idea that, oh, you have a little boy and he plays with dolls, and so they take you to the doctor and they go trans you. It's the exact kind of fear mongering that Matt Walsh had in his child's book, Johnny the Walrus or whatever. It's just not how anything is, and it's just fear mongering. It's no different, honestly, than that level of out and out bigoted fear-stoking fervor. It's the same kind of idea. However, where was I going with this? Talking about. I lost the thread. I had something to go with. Oh, I'll just let it play out.
To their sex.
I mean, it's worse than that they latch onto it. They suggest sell it.
No, they don't.
You know, these books for 2 and 3 and 5-year-olds that say you must examine your gender.
Yeah, examine.
I've got
Why would that be bad?
A girl from America, I think she must have been about 12 when this happened to her. She says, I was in a very
Happened
liberal
to
school.
Oh, that was the thing I was going to get. It cuts at odds. I remember now. So this conspiracism, like it's imposed from without, yada yada, etc. It cuts at odds with one another thing that transphobes also like to trot out as though it's evidence of anything. Is they talk about this like desistance rates because they try to act like, oh, look at all these people who are detransitioning because they realized it was a mistake. Even the transes know that they're wrong. This is massively misreported, but one of the noteworthy things that gets trotted out is like, oh, look, there was some study where they showed 90% of kids desisted or whatever. And so clearly it's not like most of the time trans people aren't actually trans. However, the problem with that study was that these kids were people who were ones who showed some sign of gender nonconformity, did not begin any sort of trans treatment, just were evaluated for like whether they might be, or like they showed some sort of like gender nonconformity, weren't trans, didn't proceed past that, and it's called desistance as though it were anything when it was actually nothing. And it cuts at odds with this idea of like, oh, well, why weren't all of them transed? If this dark cabal of endocrinologists is really out there being like, oh, this girl played with a truck, time to cut off her tits. That's not what happens. It's not a thing. It's not real.
And she says there was so much peer pressure to either be gay or trans at this school. Basically, it felt like you weren't cool if you were heterosexual. This made me even question
now we have
myself,
the single anecdote from the anti-trans person that you can definitely trust and is reliable and definitely happened and is real. And then everyone clapped, and that man's name was Albert Einstein.
2 times, even though I'm heterosexual. I know that this pressure can be real for so many children. Some of them may actually be gay or trans, and I will definitely support them and fight for them in the end. But that's pretty young to be labeling yourself in any permanent way, in my opinion.
So that's the neat thing about when children are trans is that it's not in any permanent or no or whatever the other adjective you use way. The steps of transition for a young person start with social transition. Literally no permanent change. Literally none. Just be like, oh, hey, do you want us to use something different? Do you want us to use different pronouns? Do you want to dress different? Cool. Literally it. And if they don't like it, okay, then don't do that anymore. We'll use different name and pronouns from you after that, after you decide you don't like it or whatever. It's literally nothing permanent. The next step would be before puberty, if it seems like there's a lot that goes into it. This isn't I'm I'm condensing and simplifying a lot. Then if it gets to be they're about to start puberty and it seems like they're still interested in like what they still are trans, they still like they still feel like that is a better expression of who they are. Okay, puberty blockers. Again, not permanent. They are very reversible by just not taking them anymore. They're designed to work that way from the outset. So puberty blockers. Then after that, you can just like make additional decisions. By that point, they're reaching adulthood. And at adulthood, you can make permanent decisions about yourself. Why not? That's the whole point. So like this fear mongering of like, oh, these kids are trans and they're like, and that's why I made that joke about like, oh, the little girl's playing with the truck, time to cut off her tits or whatever, because a 7-year-old doesn't have any to cut off, but they act like that's happening. It's just fear mongering. It's just bigoted fear mongering.
She was a very bright girl. She's actually written
and
books.
Dawkins is playing into it.
About
God
science
damn it,
for children. That's very, very impressive. And I was really depressed to read her letter. That there is peer pressure and even teacher pressure.
Yeah, definitely real. Definitely a thing that's real and happened, and everyone clapped.
Really go against reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And teachers think that they're being progressive, So in this country, we don't have a syllabus for sex ed, for relationships and sex ed. There's some sort of very vague things that you're meant to cover.
Oh, okay, sure.
Like the facts about sex and gender identity. or the facts about sexual orientation and gender identity without telling you what those facts are. I don't think there are any facts about gender identity.
Well, I'm sure
And
you
so there are
don't,
these
but there
external
are.
providers who are basically lobby groups that write unbelievably inaccurate materials and then sell them to schools.
So remember,
I
like, this is her characterization of inaccurate information. She, who is not an expert, who has said from the outset that she disagreed in principle from the beginning, before she knew anything about it. She who conflates sex and gender, who has very deep personal commitment to her gender being special and unique and profound. Um, she thinks it's inaccurate. What if you're wrong, though, lady?
I've seen short videos, and they're so nicely made. There's one by a guy who calls himself Ollie, and his sidekick is a balloon, and they call themselves Pop and Ollie. And Pop and Ollie, it's very bright and colourful, and they're like, your sex is the best guess that a doctor had when you were born. They looked at you and guessed.
It is a guess.
We're guessed.
For what it was. Yeah, it's a guess. It's
We're
a guess.
waiting for you.
So I get they're like all mad about this, but sex isn't a binary, as Dawkins seemingly I don't know if he pretended, if he lied, if he's somehow ignorant of the fact that it's just not. But yeah, it's a guess because they don't DNA test you. They don't check if you make the large gamete. They don't like do whatever hormonal test to determine if you have an expressed SRY gene or whatever. They look at your genitals and be like, "That's a dick. You're a boy." That's what that's the totality of what happens. This isn't some like scientific rigor that goes into this, and this is why you have cases where like Hunter Avalon mentioned, where it's like, oh yeah, like they have a vagina, but then you come to find out they have like Swyer syndrome or whatever, or whatever other like intersex conditions it could be. And often, or I shouldn't say often, it's a very small percentage wise, but in terms of raw number, it's a decent amount. Some amount of the time, the person has ambiguous genitalia, and they just like make a decision and like do a surgery to make it the one they think it is, based on basically nothing. It is a guess. It's an educated guess, you could say, but it's a guess.
Wait a minute.
They guess your sex.
You had a penis, and yet they guessed.
Yes.
Yeah, they
guess.
guess.
A doctor.
Yeah, they often conflate this fact that there are people who have differences or disorders of sex development, which is a tiny number of people.
Yeah, so this is the other thing TERFs have to do. They have to go like, oh, it's a tiny number of people, because they want to act like they don't exist. Because the existence of intersex people is a huge problem for them. Because one, they're saying, remember, Dawkins said previously that sex is binary. So that there are people that are intersex flatly proves him wrong. Like, just no question, there's no argument, he's just wrong. But then when they want to extrapolate from that, because remember, that's how you get to biological essentialism, which we've seen before. When they extrapolate from that, well, therefore, there are two genders, because sex and gender are the same thing, which is also not true, but that's harder to disprove. Therefore, there are two genders, and they're associated with your sex. If they were being honest about that, they'd have to, at a minimum, say that intersex people are a third gender. Right, they'd have to. In a minimum third gender, there might be. You could draw additional lines between each, like different kinds of intersex or whatever. But they can't do that. They have to say it's binary. Remember, that's where they're starting and where they have to end. So they have to say, okay, no, they don't. They're like so minuscule that they might as well not exist. But they do exist, and they're pretty like they're pretty damning to your argument that just by existing.
I mean, a few people do need investigations too.
Investigations.
Exactly. And even then,
So he said point not 2%, so 0.02%. Let's do some math. There are. Oh, hold on. First. Hello? Okay. 7.88 billion people. All right. Uh, 7.888 is where it was. So that's million, thousand, hundred, right? Billion people times 0.02. Oh, sorry. It should be sorry, times point. Sorry. Well, we'll redo this. I just realized the mistake I made. How do I full clear this? All right, this was supposed to be much faster. 7888 times 0.0002. There we go. 1.5 million people. Like, this is what I mean. Like, yes, the percentage is really small, but we have there's a large population of people. That percentage extrapolated is a huge number of people for you to be like, oh, they don't exist, which they have to say for their argument to work.
No, mostly they're getting investigated for conditions.
So I guess congratulations,
that don't pass down to their sex. It's just their genitals
1.5
not
million
developed
people
normally.
just don't exist.
So, I mean, probably about half a dozen people a year in this country, in Britain, have their sex assigned at birth. The rest of us, the doctor writes it down. Anyway, so it says, so the doctor...
But again, the doctor isn't, like, doing any sort of tests. He's looking at your genitals, and...
guesses your sex, and then when you're old enough, you get the chance to tell everybody what sex you are. Are you male, female, a boy or a girl, or something else in between? And then
notice the conflation of sex and gender
come
again.
Behind him, and it looks like you're going through the galaxy. And it says, or something else entirely.
Yeah.
And we get off this putative sex spectrum down here. What are you meant to make of this if you're 8? Like,
Right.
first off, that you're
Well,
very
first of
bored.
all, 8-year-olds could probably understand it better than you could, but the idea is that sex and gender are both spectrums, and that where you land on a gender spectrum is nebulous. There's all sorts of places. People have tried to quantify this, but it's not. There are infinite points on the spectrum. There are as many different genders as there are people alive, dead, and that are alive now, have been alive, or will be alive. No two people are identical on the aspect of gender. We categorize into groups because it helps us understanding, and this is where we get these modes of like, well, most people are comfortable being men or women, but there are people who are more comfortable being neither or both or something else. This is where we get like non-binary people. It's really not that hard to understand.
If you think you're a boy or a girl. But also, you're just given no hints as to what this gender thing is. So you look around.
You define gender. You tell me, without conflating sex and gender, you tell me what gender is. Obviously, this is why part of why they conflate sex and gender is so they can be like, oh, it's just your sex. But like, what we mean by gender is obviously not identical to your biological sex. Why should women have long hair and wear dresses? Why, like, that's a gendered aspect. What would you call, how would you define gender when it regards to that?
See Barbie and G.I. Joe and
And this is where it gets again to like, okay, the response might be like, oh, well, women shouldn't have to have long hair and wear dresses. Cool, I agree with you. But at a certain point, it breaks down. If there are no expectations, then you land yourself in gender abolition again, wherein there's no problem with a trans person getting feminizing hormones and surgeries and wanting to use different pronouns. There's no problem whatsoever because we've gotten to the point where biology should have no impact on the way you live your life, or right, like your roles and expectations in society, right? But they want to enforce those roles.
Sort of thing, and you say
They
well,
just
I
don't
like
think
Barbie,
they do because
I
it's in
might
a
be
much
boy.
what they see as
It's
a more minor way.
regressive.
Yes. Somewhere in your book, there's a story about a mother who had 8 children, and she said, and not a single one of them is boring cis. Is that what she
That's
said?
No
right.
one says
so
cis is
so cis is
boring.
this very new coinage that's by analogy with trans.
Yes.
Because what they don't want is you saying, real women and trans women.
Well, because it's bigoted, yeah. They don't want you being a bigot. I guess that I'll own that one. Yeah, I'm pretty opposed to bigotry. That's my bad. That's on me.
Or normal women and trans women, or actual women and trans women. They want there to be 2 types of women, so they need a symmetric word to trans, and that is cis.
Well, it's
On the
you
same
need a word
side.
for the description of like a woman who is not trans, right? So cis fills that void. Now you want to say normal and regular and whatever because these are loaded terms because you want to ostracize, and by implying that trans women are not normal, you fulfill your political end. So don't get mad when other people are just trying to find a word that is without that bias and without that much loaded into it.
Of.
Yes.
And so this woman, I found this quote in a closed Facebook group in America for parents of trans kids. somebody gave me a password into it, and I lurked there for a while and watched. And there were doctors, gender doctors in there, selling treatments, answering questions with extremely inaccurate information, like claiming that
Inaccurate to
science is
her.
settled on things that it's not. But most
I
of
would
what you saw,
love an example, right? Remember, she obviously doesn't know what the fuck she's talking about, but she's confident to say like these doctors are absolutely wrong about what they're saying, but isn't confident enough to give an example of a thing that's wrong. Probably because those things aren't wrong.
was the parents reinforcing each
She
other's.
probably doesn't think. She probably does think they're wrong. To be fair, she's probably not hiding it. I just mean to say like, without an example, I'm inclined to not take her at her word because she doesn't know what she's talking about.
False beliefs. So a new parent will come in and go, "Hi, my great little trans boy, which is a girl. She's 4. I'm learning so much from her. Sorry, I've forgotten which way around I'm having this child. Let's say it's really a girl, and this girl said,
Yeah, see, like, notice how much more difficult it is for you to describe the world when you should just be saying, "Oh, she was assigned male at birth and she identifies as a girl, so she's a trans girl." Or I guess she did it the other way, right? But she wants to misgender this trans person, so she's going out of her way to be like, "Oh, no, no, you're really this, and you're wrong about who you are, and I'm going to misgender you and make your life worse because it breaks my puny little brain."
says she's a boy. My little trans guy, I'm learning so much from him, but I'm just wondering, I'm a bit worried about socially transitioning him in case I'm leading him on the path to medicalisation, and then people will love bomb her and come in and say, "Wow, great to have you here with us."
Love bomb. That is what religious cults do.
It's what a lot of people do. You fucking goddamn Dawkins, for real. That was a pretty piece of shit line. You've been pretty terrible this whole talk so far, but that one's exceptionally bad. No, it's not a cultist behavior. People are encouraging, and like maybe like she's using the term love bomb because it's how it seems to her. But I wouldn't be surprised if people were like, "Oh yeah, like good for you for supporting your child." I guess this is the world we live in. That's some shitty behavior, right? Bad parents are out there supporting their kids, according to Helen Joyce.
Love bomb is the phrase they actually use, I think.
Yes, that's right. And then if you step out
But
of
notice,
line,
like, it's the anti-trans activists who use the term, and not these parents who are like, "Oh yeah, good for you for supporting your kid." They're not like, "Yeah, let's love bomb." Helen Joyce, who's trying to paint things a certain way, is
if at any point you say, "Well, I'm not going to do whatever this thing is," and you are just going to get piled on,
apostate.
and you'll get kicked out.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
the
I
thing
bet.
that these
Yeah,
people
and then
use more than anything
everybody
else
claps.
is
Yeah.
the emotional blackmail of telling you that if you don't get with the program, your child will kill themselves.
Yeah, the emotional blackmail of not of opposition to bigotry. It's the emotional blackmail of being like, well, if I don't let black people into my restaurant, then people will say I'm a bigot and a piece of shit and boycott me. Oh, the emotional blackmail.
That is appalling because well, put it another way, the evidence for that had better be damn good. Otherwise, it is the most appalling.
Well,
blackmail.
but
How good
here
is
you
the
are
evidence?
not trying
I
to
mean,
find
the
out what the evidence
that
is.
It does lead to suicide.
It doesn't. So the important thing to understand.
Well, hold on, wait, back that up. YouTube, why? Why does it have trouble going back just 5 seconds now? It's done this a few times in the past. I normally don't have this issue. I don't know why. Yeah, it has to like reorient itself. All right, I guess we're not going back anymore. I think refreshing helped last time. I don't know what the hell this problem is. I'll give it a second or two. While we are, how's everyone feeling? Oh, I didn't even realize their thumbnail was oh, look at their like getting all the one instance where a trans athlete did well in an event, and they're like, "Oh, this is like an abomination because trans people shouldn't be in women's sports, or they can be as long as they're not winning." And the like anti-trans shit that went along, like it's fine. She's just a competitor.
You say, "Well, I'm not going to do
Yeah,
whatever this thing
heretic.
is,"
Then
and you are just going to get piled on,
apostate.
and you'll get kicked out.
Yeah.
And the thing that these people use more than anything else is the emotional blackmail of telling you that if you
emotional
don't get with the
blackmail,
program,
okay.
your child will kill themselves.
Now that is appalling because well, put it another way, The evidence for that had better be damn good, otherwise
I
it is
missed
the
that
most
part.
appalling.
Yeah, it is, by the way. So there's studies on this. As I understand, the odds of a trans kid committing suicide or attempting suicide drops by like 94% if they have one supportive parent. Really, it's like that big of an impact. So it's not emotional blackmail like you absolute piece of shit who are like you're they're telling you this is how things are, and you're like, how dare you blackmail me and like say if I don't, my kid will kill himself. No, they're just telling you like how big of an impact you have on this kid's life, and you're saying, well, I don't give a shit. I want to be a bigot to my kid anyway. Um, and yeah, the evidence is pretty good. Like 94% reduction in suicidality.
Blackmail. How good is the evidence? I mean, the evidence that it does
How
lead
good
to
is the
suicide.
evidence? A woman who has a vested interest in lying about this and has misrepresented and conflated things constantly so far. Please be honest about the truth of the matter and the
It
facts at
doesn't.
hand.
So the
It
important
doesn't.
thing
Yeah.
to
Oh no, it just doesn't.
understand
Yeah. Oh no.
is that the reason they say
No.
suicide, it's not just that
No
it's emotional
justification.
blackmail, it's that they're suggesting that you put your child on a pathway that leads to sterility. Because if you put a child on puberty blockers early in puberty and then you put them on cross-sex hormones, at some point, we
So
don't know exactly
you don't
when,
put
but maybe
them
at
on
20 or
cross-sex hormones. They decide whether that's what they want to do. And yeah, as it turns out, some people are okay with that, and that's fine. If they're okay with that, then that okay. Like, but you're upset that remember this is back to like sex is about reproduction. She is in a way saying like by dint of being born, you are obligated to reproduce.
21, you've missed your opportunity. Your own sex organs are not going to grow. You are not going to be a person who can
And if they're okay with that,
conceive or impregnate somebody else. So they're sterilizing children.
and she's saying, okay. Notice how she says like they're sterilizing children. No, they're not. Puberty blockers aren't sterilization, and by the time cross-sex hormones would be taken by a person, they're, as I understand it, at least 16, which is the age of medical majority in most countries, but barring that, possibly 18, where they are adults and they are allowed to make that decision. And if you don't like it, too fucking bad. I don't give a shit. That's not your call to make. But she's saying they're sterilizing children. Just not true. Um, oh, I forgot where I was going with that. All right, well.
And the only reason you would ever do that is to save a child's life.
Oh, that's the other thing. She's like she's using this. Remember, she's using this to outweigh, if you remember, our types of counter arguments. She's saying like, oh, well, being supportive reduces their chance of suicidality, and she's saying, well, that doesn't matter because being supportive leads to them being sterilized. She would rather them kill themselves. She would rather trans kids kill themselves than be sterile. Like she just said that. I don't know why we're taking this. We take people like this seriously.
Death. It has to be death or sterility.
Yes.
So that's why
it doesn't have to be, by the way. A lot of trans people, before a lot of trans people do end up going through puberty as their birth sex, and so will sometimes like freeze their eggs or their sperm or whatever, so like they can't have kids in the future. But also like imagine we get to the point in technology where womb transplants are like pretty easily to do, especially with like artificial wombs. What if trans women could get artificial wombs? Would you still be mad? Like, oh, but now they can give birth. Now they're not sterile. Well, she would still be mad, right? Because that's like an abomination or whatever. She doesn't actually give a shit about the fertility thing. She doesn't like it, and she doesn't like transness, and she's making up reasons why it's bad.
Not a lot of children committing suicide, thankfully. It's very, very rare in minors to commit suicide. So that's the first.
Notice that very, very rare in minors, but she can't reckon with the fact that like trans people's suicide rate is pretty high because they're so thoroughly marginalized by society. And again, just having one supportive parent reduces that suicidality rate by 94%, and she's trying to wave that away like it doesn't matter.
True. There's an enormous boom in trans identification. There has been no concomitant boom in suicide, again, thankfully. But there have actually been a few papers that have looked at children who are on the waiting list for gender clinics. And what they have found is that these children, they do have a lot of mental health comorbidities. So you are seeing higher rates of depression, anxiety.
Gee, I wonder why a trans kid in a society filled with TERFs and people like Helen Joyce saying that like you're wrong and you're a contagion and like you're absolutely incorrect about who you are. I wonder why someone in that position might be depressed. Can we think of anything? Is there like personally I'm drawing a blank. I have no idea why that could possibly be the case. But beyond that, like beyond the obvious joke there, the insistence that like comorbidities be completely avoided, otherwise it's inauthentic or it's insincere or whatever she's about to extrapolate to, because I've heard this before, so I know where she's going, is absurd, right? Like you might as well say like, oh, this person wants to get a vasectomy but they're also depressed, so like we can't let that happen. Or this person wants to get LASIK eye surgery but they have anxiety, so I can we really be sure that's what they want? We only do this with trans stuff because they just are, like I said, they're just making up reasons why it's not okay to be trans.
That's there anyway, and they're
Yes.
depressed anyway, or
Yes.
or bulimic.
Depressed anyway, or depressed because of the marginalization they experience?
Well,
or
they
something like that,
they say that of course that it's the stress, the minority stress.
Okay,
that's
all
causing
right. So
these
you've
things,
heard
but there's
this.
no evidence that that's true.
Oh, there's just no. Oh,
It's at
just
least
no.
as
Just
probable, and I would
no.
say much
It's not
more
true.
probable that a child who's
And who
looking-
cares? What like? Okay, let's just say like okay, they're also depressed. As I understand it, gender transition is an effective treatment for gender dysphoria and that depression. Okay, so they're depressed. This is a potential cure. This is potentially helpful towards that end. Who cares? Why are we acting like being depressed should be disqualifying for gender affirming care?
for solutions to feeling miserable, and is sold that if you're trans, you can reinvent yourself. You're like a phoenix. You'll rise from the ashes, a new person. All your problems will be left behind. So yes,
Well, no one says all your problems, but like I like how callously she's just dismissing the possibility that the transition makes people's lives happier, which it tends to, as long as they're not marginalized.
is a little higher than it is in the general population.
People being
but
free to be
not out of
themselves
line
tends
for
to make them
mental
happier.
health conditions.
I'm sorry that upsets you, Helen.
And important to say, there is literally no evidence that transitioning the child will decrease that risk.
Yes, so it
I mean, there
does
is,
seem
but
like
sure, whatever.
Terrible emotional blackmail. People like you.
I love how just even he couldn't muster any interest in what's going on. Oh yeah, that sounds like yeah, it's bad, I guess. Yeah. Anyway, we should talk about the next question. I like how he even doesn't give a shit. Like, this is what you're here for, my dude.
Enough about this. Mostly women, I suppose, are getting an awful lot of persecution. I think.
Well,
they're
no,
very
no, it's
brave.
not a bunch. Okay, so it's not that women are getting a bunch of persecution because of it. It's TERFs. They're a particularly loud movement that happens to be mostly women. But as I understand, they're an anomaly. Even in the UK, most women are supportive of trans people. It's just this very loud minority of, let's be real, fascists. And when I say, and I don't mean like because they are anti-trans, they're fascists. I mean they're fascists that happen to be anti-trans. Posey Parker is the noteworthy one in that regard. If you don't believe me, look into her. No, she's like openly a fascist. And the more people aligned with her, the more fascists infiltrate. Well, I shouldn't say even infiltrate, but the more say they have in these kinds of things.
And J.K. Rowling's very brave. Kathleen Stock's
Very brave. Oh yeah, so brave.
Forstater is very brave.
My
Is that how you pronounce
Forstater.
it?
Wow.
Yes, it is.
Yes. What gives you the courage?
I
The
mean, I
courage.
don't want to answer
What gives
for
you the
anybody else,
courage
although I work
to
with Maya
express
daily,
your
so I
bigotry?
sort of see
Please
where she
tell me
comes from
about
with it.
how hard you've had it
And
being
I know
a bigot.
Kathleen, and I've met Jo Rowling. It's my privilege to have met her. In my case, I was lucky to work somewhere that has a very collegiate and rigorously intellectual atmosphere, namely The Economist. But even there, of course, there were people who didn't agree that I should be speaking about this, and it was awkward on occasion. I would say in my
It's so
case,
awkward
I
that
was
people
in too
didn't
deep.
like me being bigoted.
I was so far steeped in blood that there was no way back. Like I before I knew that this was going to be a problem, I was so far in that I couldn't get back. And then I was quite negative about it. I really felt that something very bad was happening, and all the people who think that something very bad is happening, they'll pick a different bit of it they'll say it's about free speech, or it's about women's rights, or it's about children's health, or it's about just, basic reality or sanity. And it was all of those things.
What are you
for me.
even talking about?
But then I went to an event at which some detransitioners were speaking, and this would have been, I think.
By the way, most people who detransition do so for either due to societal pressures, like people like this, like TERFs making their lives miserable, and other people marginalizing them or assaulting or doing whatever else, or because they can't afford it anymore because it's expensive and healthcare fucking sucks. People have to people just can't afford to do what needs to be done. It's not
Late
like because they
2019.
decided that it's not for them anymore.
And I found it a
Most of the time.
profoundly upsetting event. So at this
By the way, like the percentage of people who are like quote unquote true detransitioners, people who like regret their decision and like not because they were pressured or whatever, but because like they actually didn't think it was for them and they made a mistake or whatever, is so vanishingly small. But people like this are like comfortable being like, oh, they're so representative and they're so right and it's so true, we should listen to them, but will completely ignore the larger group of people of intersex as like they basically don't exist. Act like they don't exist because it's bad for us. It's bad for our argument.
one in particular, there were 6 young women. Of course, there are boys who transition and detransition too, but this was 6 young women, all of whom had thought they were boys. And they were all of them lesbians who had been misled by their early gender nonconformity into thinking they must be boys, and they had gone various stages down the medical pathway. And one of them, who was 23, was this very articulate young woman who had suffered from anorexia in her teens, and at 18 had stumbled upon the idea
That sucks.
that
And they're going to be mistakes. But by the way, people regret literally every medical intervention that ever happens. There are people who have had life-saving surgery who have regretted it. Like even I've had pretty major surgery before, and even I had like a moment. I don't regret it for what it's worth, but like even I had the moment of like, was this worth it? Because like I saw the scars or whatever. This isn't delegitimizing, even if there are people who regret it. As I understand, medical intervention for trans people has about the same regret rate as literally any other medical intervention. Literally any. It's pretty typical. And obviously we should work to reduce the regret rate across the board, but it's not exceptional in any way. So to act like, oh, it's an argument against medical intervention for trans people, it's just not. It's just not. You might as well say people shouldn't get bypass surgery because they'll regret it.
to starve away her curves because she was meant to be a boy. And by 21 she had all her sex organs removed and was on testosterone. She had no breasts, no uterus, no ovaries. She had a beard, her hair was receding. And by 23...
Oh, I think I know who this person is. That if this is the person who I think it is, the hair receding lady, I guess she goes by she, her now. As I understand it, like a lot of these, like I guess I won't say because I don't know this is the same
She
person.
still had an eating disorder. She one day had the thought, how can an operation, namely a hysterectomy, that only a woman can have, turn me into a man? And that bounced her.
There's so many things wrong with that. I hope by now it's clear what's wrong with that sentiment, right? It's making so many assumptions, and that none of which are in line with how trans people talk about themselves or what transition is.
All the way back to I am a woman, that is just a fact about me. And so I sat there and I listened to these young women, and I have a very soft spot for gay kids. I have a gay son myself. He's never had gender dysphoria, it's important to say that. He's never had any theory.
Oh, so that idea that people who that trans people are just like gay and told they're trans isn't really a thing, that those don't really map onto each other in any meaningful way. All right, neat. Cool.
Or anything like that. But I have a soft spot for these kids because they're quite non-conforming, and finding your way as a teenager is difficult anyway. But for these kids, it's a little bit more difficult because as they're growing up, they're also realizing they're different.
I mean, how many of these children do you think are just simply gay anyway?
Well, I mean, according to the Tavistock Clinic, which is the UK's main gender identity clinic for children, the great majority of the children they see are same-sex attracted. There's a strong statistical
So they could have been
link.
perfectly happy.
Yes.
Nope. So this is another conflation that happens of like, oh, well, like, why can't they just be a feminine gay man? Because that's not the same thing. Because that wouldn't let them live authentically as themselves. It would just be a different mask they put on. Instead of being a masculine man, they would be a feminine gay man, but that doesn't allow them to live in the way that is authentic to themselves, which is being a woman.
Yes, so we are turning potentially healthy gay adults into sterile, straight simulacra of the opposite.
So again, the like conspiracy of like we are doing this. No, people are choosing to transition, and like again, the obsession with sterility. A lot. Even she was saying a huge amount of trans people don't undergo medical intervention. Even she was saying that earlier. Do you remember? She was talking about like most trans people don't. I don't know what the actual percentage is. I don't know if she's right or wrong, but according to her, there's actually not that many people who are getting like bottom surgery and whatever and or become fully sterile. So like no, that like they're just trans now. Like they're God damn it, this is so rough.
Opposite sex.
I really want a
One of the
dissenting
points you
voice
make,
in the
I think,
room
is that
for like
there
how
are
many
certain
just false
parents who
things they're
would rather
saying.
have a trans child than a gay child, and
Yes.
is that part of the motivation?
Yeah, and I don't think it's always stated up front. And you know, some people think that that's very implausible. But I think that they don't realise the dynamic in some families and in some cultures, as in, you know, local cultures in the school or whatever. It's really hard to be gender non-conforming, like right bone deep gender non-conforming. I don't mean someone like me who's a fairly normal woman but did a PhD in maths. I mean
The hell do
somebody
you
that
mean bone
everything
deep?
about your style and your taste and the way you move. And
Well, it
your
doesn't have
interest.
to be thorough, right? Like you, the degree to which a person can be gender non-conforming can vary, right? Some people can be extremely gender non-conforming. Some people can be like, as you say, like a woman, but then like have a few things that are more masculine. I wouldn't agree that the degree in mathematics is a male thing, but like you know if she, for example, I don't know, liked being a mechanic or something, like was super into cars. I don't know. Again, like things that don't necessarily have to be for men, but like it's unexpected for women. Like that could be gender nonconforming. There's a whole degree of this, but she's like insist. I don't know why she's being insistent. Like, oh, it's so rare to
Just
be like
really
through and
screams,
through
you know,
non-conforming.
camp for your boy or butch if you're a girl. And you have to be let a lot of freedom to be yourself, and not a lot, you know, nothing
But
must be
also like
made.
here we get that insistence again, like to like oh I guess like it's so hard to be so thoroughly not gender non-conforming that you would be the other gender. Um, but like why would you have to be? Not all men are super butch, so why would a trans man have to be? They could just be they could just feel that they're better represented by being considered a man. Why is that insufficient for you?
Made of this by the grown-ups around you. And if things start to be made about it, you start to question yourself and think like, why am I so different? Like, why am I a boy who only likes the girls? And why am I a girl who only likes the boys? What's wrong with me? And then the thought comes up in your
What?
own mind, was I meant to be a girl? Was I meant to be a boy? Like, we knew this already in about 2000. The research had been done. The papers had been examined. We know that the gender nonconformity comes first in these kids, and the gender dysphoria, the distress, is a result of the gender
Oh,
nonconformity
okay.
and the meaning that is
What
made
does
of
that have to do with anything?
So if no meaning is made of it, you just grow up,
Yeah,
and you might be an unusual
that would
straight
be
person,
that would be more gender abolitionist than what you were comfortable with.
but you're quite likely to be gay. But if a lot of meaning is made out of it, you interpret that as being that there's a woman inside or there's a man inside. And then the people around you may think that too. And your
Yeah, if
parents
the
may
term
find
man and woman are meaningless, truly meaningless, that there is no implication of you're a man therefore or men are like this. If those kinds of sentences don't make any sense, then yeah, I would imagine there'd be a lot less gender dysphoria. But they're not meaningless currently. And you don't want them to be meaningless because you seem to have some bugaboo about like, no, if you were born male, then you can't do certain things like act like a woman, whatever that means, you know?
this very hard. Like a man who's always wanted a boy to take to the football, and
Yeah.
you know he can, with the best will in
Notice
the
again,
world, he
like,
may
oh,
fail.
it's so telling. A man who wanted a boy who could take to the football, right? Like, clearly there is some impact of that gender has in our society. There is an implication of you are a boy, therefore. So it's so like I don't know why we're acting like, oh, therefore like it's kind of nonsense that this gender nonconformity should mean that you're another gender. Like I don't know.
Ill to not seem disappointed.
Yeah.
And the same with the mother who wanted a daughter who went to ballet and to go shopping with and so on, and she gets some little rough and tumble.
Here we get all the
character who
gender
wants tree
therefores,
climbing and
yeah.
rugby. You get the impression that you're a big disappointment to your parents, and this dynamic can unfold.
Okay. But
between
you
them
aren't
both. And
out
what you
here
need is family
advocating for
therapy,
gender
really.
abolition. You're out here
Who's someone
saying no, you
supportive
can't
to
be
point this out
trans.
to you and to guide you gently through, and instead you end up in a gender clinic and they say, oh, you're
Guide
transgender
gently
again.
through to what? To saying the like to the little like let's talk about the little girl who wants to play rugby or whatever. Like what's the guiding through? What do you think the ought should be? Like where like you say okay the gender clinic is wrong. Okay, what ought to happen? You say guide through to where? Right? To it's okay to play rugby and be a woman. Well, if we get to the point where none of it matters, then yeah, sure, whatever. Right? We're fully going to gender abolition world, and I'm glad for it. But that doesn't happen, and instead it's like, well, okay, girls don't do that, and like you should like these things and whatever else. Well, then you're enforcing the rules that you claimed not to, and at that point, well, if someone doesn't fit into the concept of the gender they were assigned, but they do feel they would fit into another gender, then you get a trans person, and that's how you get the gender clinic. It's really that easy.
Entity. Oh, you have a little trans boy, you have a little trans girl.
Nobody says that from
I think
outside,
in
by
the
the way.
past, we've
It's
just
said
said,
from
well,
it's
she's
said
a
by the
tomboy
trans person.
and, you know,
Well, with a girl you would have.
Yes.
Poor old boys, the boys, they tried to straighten them out.
yes, yes,
Horrible.
yes.
But the girls was much easier.
Easier
You just
with
let them
girls.
out, tell them
Yes.
to climb some trees and
Yes,
look back
yes.
when they're 16.
Yes.
Okay,
I'm
so
perfectly happy
so
to,
you're more okay with the gender abolition stuff, but you're not out here advocating for gender abolition, right? Like you're out here against trans stuff. Like I feel like this like the view she's espoused, like I could either talk her over to full gender abolition, at which point like the trans stuff is really easy to justify because if gender doesn't mean anything, then who cares what trans people do, right? But uh or if that was unsuccessful, out how clearly she doesn't believe what she's saying, right? Make it very clear. And it's like given what she said, it should be really easy to demonstrate that in a conversation with her where there's actual pushback.
address a trans person by their preferred name and preferred pronouns. I think it's just a matter of politeness, really.
Let's see if
What I
Helen
object
is
to
on
is
board with that.
Um,
Yeah, I'm happy to do this,
insistence that
but
I am a woman. I mean, you're not a woman. I'm perfectly prepared to call you she if you like, and call you whatever you prefer.
this is the conflation of sex and gender again.
To say
can't
I
do
am
it.
a woman is a debauching of language, and that's where
No,
I
it's
draw the
not.
line.
I've become
It's
much
just
more
not.
hardline on this, and I would like not to be. I would have
Yeah,
started
I
where
bet.
you are. But what I've learned is that somebody who expects to be called she also expects the words woman and female and mother.
Not
and
necessarily,
sister
but
and
also
daughter.
it's kind of telling that like she's unwilling to correctly gender people because ideologically she's like, well, I don't want to give the impression that I think you're a woman, right? Like even on the basis of politeness, and she's the one who is saying like, you should be able to do or be whatever, and like just because you're a woman doesn't mean you can't play rugby or whatever. Okay, just because I'm a man doesn't mean I have to go by he him, right? Why should it mean that?
And it's very hard if you give away sexed language to explain why this person
It's not
cannot
sex
in all
language,
circumstances
it's
be
gendered
treated as a woman.
language.
So often people do this preamble. It happens to me less now, but 2 years ago when my book came out, it happened a lot. They would give a preamble to any interview with me in which they said, of course, neither of us is transphobic, and we're very happy
Oh no,
to
she
use
is.
people's names and
Yeah, I don't know why they
pronouns
would lie
and
about you either.
treat you as a woman or treat you as a man. And I started to think, like, what do you mean
No,
by
of course
treat
not.
somebody as a man or a woman? Because we've got rid of all the unjust and unjustifiable differences between the sexes.
Have
in the way
we?
treat people now.
Yeah.
Like we've equalised pension.
That's kind of an interesting claim. There's no difference in how men and women are treated. Okay, sure. I bet.
My mother had to leave her job when she got married in the Irish civil service because there was a ban on married women. We've got rid of all that stuff.
All of
And
it. Yeah.
now
There's
treating somebody as a
there's
woman
no sexism anymore. Congratulations, we did it. Yeah, definitely a thing that never happens anymore.
means either
We didn't
I
just
noticed
watch
that
Ben
they're a woman
Shapiro be sexist
in
and
a-
real
in a space, like any
about
other
the Barbie
space where it just
movie
doesn't
last
actually
week.
matter what sex people are, or it means we're in a single sex space and they shouldn't be there.
We'll come on to that in a moment.
But if you want to try and explain why, you have to use sex-based language. So I have to say the reason this person cannot come in here is because he is a man.
Yes.
Well,
if I-
no, that's not sex-based language, gender-based language. But also, notice she was saying before, like, oh, there shouldn't be any. Just because you're a man, it doesn't mean you should be able to do this. But she wants to make it the case that because you're a man, you are not allowed in a certain place. Right? The obviousness of her lies are becoming clear. Right? She does not actually believe that your gender should have no impact on your life. She's saying out loud, no, your gender should prohibit you from certain places. Because of how you were born, you should be disallowed from being in certain areas. That's pretty telling, isn't it?
I say she, I'm already selling the farm.
Yes. Do you make a distinction between people who've gone through the ordeal of surgery and being castrated or whatever and having their breasts removed or whatever, and people who just simply stand up and say, I am a woman or I am a man? It does seem
TERFs tend to be of two minds on this. On the one hand, they'll be like, oh, if you don't do any of the like medical transition, then you're just pretending and you just want the advantage of being in women's spaces without, and like you're obviously lying or whatever. But then if you do do any sort of medical transition, you're like you've mutilated yourself and you're misguided and you've been sterilized and yada yada. Like there's no winning for trans people here with TERFs.
There's almost a sense you sort of paid your dues if you've subjected yourself to. I mean, you're really serious about it. You're really earnest about it. You're not just frivolously standing up and saying, "I've decided I'm a woman today," sort of thing.
And by the way, like TERFs will take issue with the second person, the person who has begun social transition is the way I'll put it. Who has not gone and undergone any sort of medical intervention and is either socially transitioned or beginning to, and they'll say they're just as illegitimate. Why, right? What issue could you have with that? It's just a matter of how you treat people, and like the words you use to refer to them. But she's already said she's not willing to say she, her for a trans woman. So like, oh, okay, so now we're adding on to what I was hinting at before, what I was implying before, but now she's agreeing. Like we're seeing more agreement with. Like, no, if you're born a man, you are not allowed to be referred to by she, her pronouns. What happened to the whole, like, you can be or do whatever?
I don't make any distinction because I don't think that being a woman or a man is the sort of thing that you pay a price to be.
Yes.
It's just a very base fact about
Yeah,
it.
I agree. Someone who has undergone no medical transition is exactly as legitimate in their gender as someone who has undergone medical transition. Yeah. I just agree that they're also the gender with which they identify. And you would deny them that.
Okay.
But more than that, in a space where a man is not supposed to be, I don't know whether he's been castrated.
A man
or
is not
I'm
supposed to
from his
be.
secondary sex
Don't know if
features,
he's been
and they don't
castrated.
change.
Yeah, so like that's another thing. Like now this is the thing I've been mentioning before, that I've mentioned on previous streams. Like she's saying like, oh, I don't know if he's been castrated or not. Basically, I can only look at gender signifiers, not sex ones, because those are different things. You're acknowledging now they're different things. Yeah, goddamn.
Been through the surgery. But the other reason is that.
But why should it matter, right? Like this is a presumption of men as dangerous. This is something that bothers me, irrespective of trans stuff. This is just an issue with how society views men. Is that we're invisible or dangerous? One of those two must be the case, possibly both. And this is why there's all this hysteria about bathroom bills, because they're never concerned about trans men going into men's bathrooms. No one ever has a problem with that. Like they have a problem in theory, but like ultimately that's not what's fear-mongered about. It's always about trans women being in women's spaces, because the assumption is that they're men, they're not, and therefore are dangerous to women, and it is a risk. This is why like people always talk about like, oh, you got to protect women from trans. They're just going to the bathroom, man. Like they're just gonna pee and then they're gonna leave, or maybe they'll take a shit. I don't know, whatever. They're gonna use the restroom and then they're out. Like they're not. There's no inherent danger to being male at birth. But remember, she who's like, oh, there's no reason why you should be this or that or whatever. She's like, well, no, men are dangerous. And therefore, I can't be sure. Like, maybe he has a penis. It could be, like, she's talking about it like it's a weapon, right? This is really concerning to me and something that I take great issue with. But it's suffused in particular transphobia though not exclusively there.
Rights law, there can't be any distinction on the basis of whether the person has been castrated, because it's a basic principle that's been adjudicated on now in several courts, is that you can't make something conditional on getting yourself sterilised, because it's human rights abuse to do that.
Yeah.
So if you say to people, you've paid your dues if you cut the bits off, and that'll give you the reward is that we'll now treat you as a
medical transition. I agree. Medical transition should not be a requirement for being considered your sex. The sex with which you identify should be the way you're treated, irrespective of medical intervention. Yeah, totally agree. Obviously, she's extrapolating differently. She's saying, therefore, but like in either case, you're not your gender. I'm saying in either case, you are.
A woman, or we'll treat you as a man. You are inducing people to go through a really horrific surgery that is, and to give up something. Yeah. So that cannot be.
If people want to, they can.
And then the last thing I'd say
shouldn't
is,
have
they
to
paid
medically
their dues
transition.
to whom? Like,
well, nobody says that, right?
To the other people around them, you know. Yes. If you come
I guess
into
trans
women's
medicals
space,
do, but like,
who
no.
have you paid your dues
no,
to?
Okay, paid dues is the wrong phrase, but
no, I've heard it before.
You've shown you're serious about it. You've shown that.
Yeah, it's often used as like a mechanism for determining like whether a person's like really trans, which is a thing of like, well, who gives a shit? There are a couple of scenarios where it kind of does matter. Prisons is one of them. Trans women are exceptionally likely to be sexually assaulted in prisons, in male prisons, when they're housed there, and they shouldn't be. But obviously there is a risk to, you know, if a man who, like, if someone is a cis man and they're going to go to prison, if they just say, you know, oh, I identify as a woman, you should put me with the women, there's a pretty big risk to sexual assault there. That said, it's like the only instance people like this will act like they care about sexual assault in prison, because sexual assault is a problem that should be dealt with irrespective of who's doing it or who it's being done to. But it's the kind of thing we hand wave and make jokes about. As I understand it, it's something like 1/3 of all rapes happen in prison or something, or like male prisons or something like that. It's like some absurd number, and that's the problem. Not who's being with who and who's able to do it. Like, oh, men will sexually assault women if they're in those prisons. The problem is the sexual assault. That should be what we're addressing. It's not a trans issue.
I mean, somebody who, let's talk about sports for a moment. Somebody who's a moderately good swimmer as a man, but kind of mediocre, and then suddenly just says, "I am a woman."
I'm kind of uninterested in the sports stuff.
He's then allowed to go
a bit more nuanced than I think I'm comfortable talking about. I don't think I have a clear enough view of what should be
unserious.
The solution here.
You're just saying you're a woman because you want to say you're a woman.
The things I will say are like obviously, if someone has undergone puberty for the gender with which they identify, they're probably indistinguishable biologically from cis people of the same gender, and it's probably fine. But there's I mean, I could be swayed. I don't know. There's a lot of discussion to be had there. And then the other part is that like they act as though like hulking muscle men are joining women's competitions and just absolutely crushing, but that's just not really a thing that happens. And I'm like thinking notably of one bodybuilder who was like doing weightlifting competitions before she transitioned, and people were like, oh my god, she's gonna like just crush the competition and women's competition, but she still competes with men because she gets it, right? Like it's just one of those, like, I don't know, there's a lot more nuance here than they're going to entertain. I'm not that interested. I'm probably not gonna have a lot to say here.
But he's still not a woman.
But
I'm glad she
there's a sort
went back to her two talking points.
He really means it. He's sincere about it.
I mean, I could say I was sincere about being astronaut. It doesn't make me an astronaut. And
we got attack helicopter memes.
Your sporting idiots. Performance. So if we're protecting what it is to be female in a sports category, which we are, that's how sports categories work. You know, we protect.
See, like,
under 18,
I don't know. My thought with the sports thing is like it depends on how you approach it, right? Like, our goal should be to maximize the number of people who are able to compete meaningfully and have competitive competitions, right? Like, shouldn't that be the goal? Well, then maybe the current breakdown isn't perfect for that either, because now trans people are excluded. Maybe that's reasonable. I don't really know. but it seems like there are other issues that come up that are, I don't know.
Thing that we're protecting
Like I
is
said, my thoughts on this
females.
aren't
And the fact that a man is
really
very,
well
very
developed yet.
serious in wishing to be seen as female doesn't move his category.
No, that's true. But okay, let's take the example of the astronaut that you just mentioned. Just say, I'm an astronaut, and you're obviously not. But if, on the other hand, you've gone through the rigorous training of an astronaut, and you've put yourself through all the
This is a surprising amount of pushback
really
from
rather
Dawkins
hard
here.
graft to become an astronaut, you've proved you're serious about it.
But I've also become an astronaut. So
Well,
that's the thing.
You might not become. You might be not good enough to become an astronaut, but you've
But
tried.
then I would not be an astronaut.
No, you wouldn't be an astronaut, but you've.
Astronaut's probably a
You've
bad
tried.
example, but like
Yes, I mean, I
there
don't
are some
think that
things
male and
that you
female
could-
are prizes for effort. They're just observations of categories that we are.
Yes. Yeah.
no.
I mean, it keeps the numbers down. There's that.
Yes.
But for a long time, we didn't see like men who identified as trans in women's
One thing I
sport.
want to say to someone like her is just be like, oh, well, according to you, sex is a biological category, or gender is a biological category. It's not social. So I don't have a way of looking at you and knowing what sex you are, especially because the goalpost keeps moving about concerning sex. So I guess we can't know you're a woman, right? It would actually be presumptuous of me to say you're a woman, right? And she would obviously reject this. Obviously that would be like highly insulting to somebody like this. I'd just be like, how would I know? It's not possible. I couldn't, like, I don't know what your sex is. Even if you were like, well, like, I have breasts. Well, I mean, you could have gotten breast implants. I have no way of knowing. Maybe you took hormones or whatever. Do you have a vagina? It doesn't matter. You could have gotten bottom surgery. I have literally no access to that information. Should we just not treat? But like, obviously, it's not a biological distinction. Obviously, when we gender people, it has nothing to do with biology. And she's acting like, oh, it's just like an observation. No, we don't. You don't observe anyone's sex. You have no clue what most people's sex is. You probably don't even know what your own is. You have an estimate, but you actually have, like, you can do the mind experiment. Like, how would you know that you weren't transitioned at birth and like secretly given hormones your whole life? How would you know?
Because they did set a surgery rule, and at the time the surgery was really only done on people in their 40s and older.
Yes.
So you didn't see any prime-aged men. And now that it's just a testosterone level is all that many of the sporting bodies require, that you lower your testosterone.
Which has
Honestly,
problems
they
as
can't check
I've laid
that.
out.
It's just a paper rule. It's not a real one. Younger men can identify as women, and so now we're actually seeing men who are, pretty good athletes.
And by the way, before
and
puberty,
who are
like,
then world record breakers as women.
boys and girls tend to be
But it's all wrong.
as
if you're protecting the
adept
female
athletically.
category, then no male advantage belongs
Yes.
in it.
If
It's that simple.
if we're going to have separate female athletic competitions at all, then
Yeah. And if we don't, then there will be no women who win anything.
yes. And you
Well,
could-
see, that's not true at all. Like, now we have like the presumption that like women will always be worse at everything. There are a lot of women who are a lot better than me at a lot of sports. Even if I tried to compete with them, I would get absolutely demolished because my gender isn't like this magic I win stat. Most sports, a huge number of women are better than me. It's just how it is, right? And then you have the issues of like, okay, but there's biological factors. I know someone who had growth hormone deficiency. He probably would be a much less athletic than a lot of women, even at his best. Would him competing with women be some sort of categorical problem? I'm not so sure. And that's why I mean, like, the sports thing is, I don't know. There's a lot of, it's complicated, and it's, I think, possibly the least important aspect of the trans discussion, but often the most focused on because it's so complicated.
could say everything's open. You're just
Yeah.
a human. And you go
Yeah.
in for everything, and then, as you say, women would.
Like, what if everyone was in the same category, but then like
Yes,
it
maybe
would, like, what if it
gymnastics.
wasn't
The
gender
gymnastics is an
distinct, but
interesting
then
example because male and
skill
female
level-
gymnastics are very different. Like the one thing that women
skill
really have
level
an advantage in
divided.
is flexibility.
Yes.
But male gymnastics, yes, they're flexible, but mostly they're strong. So they do very different things. They just do different events for the men and women. Neither sex would be any good in the others in
I see.
gymnastics.
Yes. Okay. There's a lot in your book about changing rooms, so we better talk about that. Tell us a bit about that.
I think another thing that people often give away when they start to think about this is they think, well, I understand that you need female-only spaces if they're, say, rape crisis centres or, really specialist services. But they think, like, oh, what about public toilets and maybe even changing rooms, like have cubicles? And they miss the point that these are sort of mass arrangements for the convenience of the half of humanity that experiences rape at the hands of the other half of humanity.
There's the presumption of danger again. Being around men will increase your chances of being raped. As it turns out, that tends not to be a thing that happens in public restrooms anyway. And like, if someone was going to rape you, the what rest like there's not a magic force field that protects you in a women's restroom from men going in there. Trans women or cis men, it doesn't matter. That's not magically going to do anything about anything.
That experiences the two most common sex crimes, which are voyeurism and exhibitionism, and they're an inclusion measure for women. So the first female public toilets were brought in so that women didn't experience what was called the urinary leash, which meant that women had to stay near the home because they needed to be able to go. And, women have to take off clothing from the bottom half of them to go to the toilet. Men don't. You're quite vulnerable when you're weeing. And so women in the Victorian era, would have to always be able to be aware that there was somewhere they could go to wee, otherwise they could get assaulted.
Why was that necessary? Okay.
And it was
your underwear doesn't magically protect you from
campaigned for the
from
first
sexual assault.
toilets,
I don't know.
because they were getting sexually assaulted if they tried to wee during a factory day. They weren't able to work outside the home. And then you think, all the special situations that
so we erected magic force fields around women's restrooms that made it impossible for any rapes to happen there, and because men are incapable of entering, right? That's what happened?
Need just ordinary spaces like toilets and changing rooms for women menstruating.
Like for real, like really think about it. If you're in a public restroom, there are one of two things. Either there are people around or there aren't. If there are people around, do you really think someone can just go in there and just start raping, and it's nothing no one's going to do anything, that's just going to happen? Okay, well obviously the people around you are the protection there, right? Not the little sign with the lady in a dress on it. That doesn't do anything, right? And if there aren't people around, do you think a man couldn't walk in there and do anything? Or do you think a potential rapist of any gender couldn't just walk in there? What does the sign do that actually helps you in any meaningful way?
As I said, women take off more of their clothes to go to the toilet. We take much longer. Young girls in particular, little girls, are at risk. If you're a man,
I've been to a gender neutral restroom. I've only been to one, so that's why I say it's notable.
You want to be able to pop her into.
Nothing. It was really. You just go in, you do your business in your stall, and then you wash your hands and you leave. There's really not anything to it. It's but her implication is the women in there were much more at risk. They weren't. There were so many people around. Nothing was going to happen. What does the sign do about anything?
The women's loos and know that there's only women in there, because she's really at risk actually if it's a mixed sex space.
Again, this men are dangerous,
and there's women who've been raped who are survivors of sexual assault and who can have really serious flashbacks in enclosed spaces if there are males there with them. And now we're losing.
What if someone has been the victim of sexual assault by a woman, right? Women can rape other women. You seem to have no issue with that. Maybe the solution to that should be that in addition to gender neutral restrooms, there should be single occupant restrooms. Anytime if there's a public restroom, should have gender neutral, two restrooms, gender neutral and single occupant. And then if you have any triggers about being around other people or whatever, you can go to the single occupant restroom. Nobody else is in there. Literally nobody. You can't have any other issues. But something that's also kind of weird is that with single occupant restrooms, they're often also labeled male or female, or I guess men and women. But why? Isn't that kind of weird? Single occupant restrooms should all be gender neutral, shouldn't they? If only one person goes in there, what does it matter what your sex or gender is? But this kind of enforcement is the kind of thing she wants, which, remember, cuts at odds with her just being a boy or a girl shouldn't mean anything about how you live your life.
All of these spaces, they're either going gender neutral or they're going self-ID. They'll put a sign up saying, use whichever space you feel most comfortable in. And about a year ago at Sex Matters, where I work with Maya Forstatter now, we put out a call for evidence as to why people cared about single-sex spaces. And we did hear stories about specialist spaces like rape crisis centres, but mostly we heard about toilets and changing rooms.
Heard what?
And this phrase got said over and over again. People wrote us almost essays about it. They said, I went along to my local swimming pool and there's a bloke who calls himself a woman who's now using the changing room. And I've never told anybody. I'm in my 50s now, but I was raped when I was 14 and I never told anybody. And I found myself in this enclosed space and I looked around and there was this bloke.
Okay, but now you're making
froze.
your trauma someone else's problem.
And I remembered everything terrible that had happened to me and I left and I never went back.
Okay, so like, obviously she's at like a TERF forum, and so obviously like there's a lot of people like this. A lot of TERFs have had traumatic experiences with men and like do that leap of like trans women are still men, and so they're like bigoted, hateful bitches about it. This is very rarely common, but we can take that same person, make a slightly different scenario, and realize how absurd what their conclusion is. She went to this public pool and like, oh, there's a man in the. She says man, probably a trans woman, in the restroom, and it made me really uncomfortable because I was raped when I was 14. What if she had said I had gone to the public pool and there were men in the pool and it made me really uncomfortable because I was raped at 14? They shouldn't be allowed to be there. It would be pretty obvious that the conclusion is ridiculous, right? Like that your trauma doesn't mean it doesn't have any sort of it shouldn't be the determinant factor of what other people are allowed to do in terms of using public spaces in the way that they're designed. Right, because this person is literally just changing in the changing room. This person isn't like approaching them, isn't sexually assaulting or sexually harassing them. They're just changing in the changing room. But this woman is like, nope, I was raped, therefore you can't be here. And what if she was raped by a woman? Can women not go into women's changing rooms? And again, what if she had just said like, well, there were men at the pool. They shouldn't be allowed to be there because I have trauma. It's nonsense. It's ridiculous. It's taking your trauma and extrapolating it into bigotry.
So women are being pushed out of public spaces again by the loss of these spaces that were introduced in order that we
Not being pushed out. She chose to leave. And this trans lady, like the trans woman that was in there, wasn't doing anything. She wasn't hurting anybody. And remember, TERFs are like they're often out to clock anyone and are notoriously bad at it. Like this lady might have gone to a public restroom, saw a cis woman, who she thought was trans, and decided to never come back. Right? Look, we have no idea but they always think they can tell. They can't. But they think they can always tell.
Before we started, which I didn't know that. Competitive swimmers, but Olympic type swimmers, have to wriggle into their streamlined swimsuits, and so they don't just sort of quickly put it on the way the rest of us do. How long does it take?
Like it can take up to 40 minutes. So I didn't know this
Really?
when I wrote the book,
Wow.
or I would have put it in. So at the time I was writing the book, there were a few athletes who were making it into elite women's sport who were men. So Laurel Hubbard was the big example.
Maybe changing rooms should just be individual stalls. Doesn't that solve like all of this problem? Isn't it kind of weird that like even when I was in school, I felt really uncomfortable changing in a changing room. Like I was surrounded by other men. This wasn't a gendered issue. It was just really uncomfortable getting undressed around and in front of other people, most of whom are strangers. Even though I went to school with them, like I mean, I didn't know who these people were. Wouldn't it solve a lot of these problems if changing rooms were individual stalls that you would change in, as opposed to here's this open mass and you just are expected to be comfortable changing in front of people because you're all the same gender? Isn't that kind of a weird expectation? But the solution to her is no, trans women shouldn't be allowed there. No, just like this individual stall problem solves even the traumatized woman's issue, but that's not the proposed solution.
Weightlifter, a man in his 40s. But in between the hardback and the paperback, along came Leah or Will Thomas, who's a young man who's 6'4".
Leah Thomas is not a young man. She's a trans woman. She's the one in that picture that they had in the thumbnail who won an event, and TERFs are mad about it.
Who's about 21, 22, and who started swimming in American college races. And I mean, it's bad enough when you look.
I don't
You see
remember all
people
the
in their
details of
swimsuits,
this.
you
I
can
just
see he's a
remember
man
that
and
it's
he's a woman, and he's
ridiculous.
really
That
towering over
they
the
lie
women.
about it
And he doesn't have
constantly.
good technique. He's just using his shoulder
Yeah,
strength
okay, I
and
bet.
kicking his legs, and he still wins.
Yeah, okay,
And
sure.
then
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, they have to paint her as like, oh, she's just like she is a man, therefore she's better at everything, at all the sports. What happened to women empowerment? No, she's a competitive swimmer. She knows how to swim. Um,
I heard one of the young women who had to compete against him describing what it is like doing competitive swimming. So they wear these streamlined
oh
suits.
yeah, the person who was getting mad about it is the person who got ninth, just being like, well, if she wasn't there, then I would have gotten eighth, and I would have like gotten like the top eight got something or something like that. And it was like, uh, okay, but like if the person who got second wasn't there, it would have been the same thing. But she just wants to exclude people from her sport and like is using the bigotry as an excuse to eliminate competition.
And the sort of they're compression suits that like just make you very cut through the water fast, and it's very very hard to get on, and the compression doesn't last all that long, so you change suit every time you race, and you also don't wear that suit when you're doing your warm-up. And there's dozens of events, all the different lengths and strokes, and there's maybe many competitors in all of them. They have these big open changing rooms, and you're running
So
in
maybe there
stripped
should be stalls
completely
instead,
naked.
right?
You put on your practice suit, you go out, you do your warm up, you come back and you strip completely naked again, and then you start this miserable business of shimmying into your race suit, which is incredibly tight, and you have to sort of wriggle and bounce and wriggle and bounce and get it up over your hips and then wriggle and bounce yourself in completely naked through all of this, and all around you everyone else is doing the same thing.
Yeah,
And
maybe.
there
Like, why does she seem? Why does it seem obvious to her that the people around her who are also doing the same thing, like, don't make that feel weird and uncomfortable? It's only the presence of someone of another gender that could possibly make that weird and uncomfortable, not being nude and for a long period of time and changing in front of people.
there's this 6'4" bloke, and in case anyone wants to know, no, he has not had surgery, and no, there are not cubicles, and no, you cannot hold a towel
So
in
it
your
should
lap.
be. So it should be.
And that's
There
what
should be
you're doing.
cubicles, right?
And
But
these
no, she wants to exclude people. No, it's the bigotry of like, no, you can't be here.
poor girls, like the girls on his own team at the
Now
university that
Leah
he's
Thomas
at,
wasn't sexually harassing anybody, sexually assaulting anyone. In fact, she was doing the same thing all these other people were doing, which was changing into her swimwear, which presumably takes the same amount of time and effort, and she's doing the same thing everyone else is doing. But when she does it, it's a cause for concern because they're hateful bigots who don't like
that
her.
all the women who had to compete against him, if they complained, they were told that they were bigots.
Well, you are a
Nobody
bigot. Like, I
gazed
don't know
at
what
the
to
one.
tell you. Like, I don't know. Like, this would be like when people were complaining that Jackie Robinson started playing baseball because he was the first, as I understand it, the first uh, black baseball player in the United States and like in the Major League Baseball. And like when people were complaining about being in the changing room with him, of like, yeah, we'd call them bigots too, but she's out here being like, oh, it's so rude that they're calling them bigots just because they have a problem with this person being in their changing room. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. The only difference is that she recognizes the bigotry of assuming black people are dangerous and is either blind to or comfortable with the bigotry of assuming men are dangerous.
One of them who's spoken out the most was warned by her university that if she kept talking about it, she would not be taken onto medical school.
Yeah,
Told she's a
there are
bigot
repercussions
by
for bigotry.
somebody
I don't know what to tell
senior
you.
in the university.
Yeah, by the sports team, by the EDI team in the university, EDI meaning Equity, Diversity and Inclusion, told that they'll be referred for counselling, the women of the university.
Oh no, not referred for counseling. The horror. Is there any greater punishment that could possibly befall a person? Oh, I guess you're right. The backlash has gone too far.
That where Leah Thomas is, I think it's University of Pennsylvania, the girls on his own team, because they complained anonymously and they finally found someone to send their complaints.
Notice the like
And they were
constant
told they would be
misgendering, but I
referred
thought you
for
were okay with
counselling.
well, what happened to like your sex shouldn't have anything to do with how you get to participate in the world.
To learn to cope with their transphobia, to cope with losing, basically.
Nope. With transphobia, because remember, at this point she hadn't lost yet. Even you, according to you, this was in advance of this was be like her issue with Leah Thomas being on the team at all. This is not being comfortable with her losing. And by the way, yeah, you should be comfortable to be losing. There were, as I understand it, this person who, in question got ninth in this event. The people to make a big deal about. There were 7 people other than Leah Thomas that did better than her. She should be okay with losing, but you're acting like, oh, it's ridiculous.
I'm baffled by why this is
Oh, and
also
there were similar things
one-sided.
with black people competing in sports too. There was like this assumption of like they're more animalistic and therefore better at sports. It's all racist bigotry, but this is all sexist bigotry or transphobic bigotry. It's the same, but it's the same thing. These conversations happen the same way.
I realize there are two different points of view here, but how has one side managed to kind of capture the dominant dialogue, really, the dominant half of the dialogue,
Yeah.
and and constantly it comes up that if you dissent from that, you're called a bigot, and so people don't want to dissent.
Well, yeah, I mean, literally, imagine a white supremacist saying the same thing, like, "Oh, the dominant dialogue that multiculturalism is good is you can't reject it, or otherwise they call you a racist." Yeah, as it turns out, words have meaning, and if you do the things that make you a bigot, you can be called one, and that makes sense actually.
Because
But like they
dissent,
chafe against it because they don't like to think of
so
themselves as bigots
I
as
don't
they
want to call
express
it
their
cowardice,
bigotry.
but
As we have a 50-minute podcast about bigotry.
um, it's pardonable cowardice because nobody wants to be called a bigot. But why does all the abuse go one way? Why is it such
All the abuse goes one way. Not for her, who's actively misgendering every trans person she ever talks about, who's saying like, no, you're wrong and you're a contagion and like you shouldn't, you're dangerous and yada yada. No, all the abuse is going one way. No, yeah, totally. No, people are just people are telling you the fact about you that you are a bigot. It's not abuse.
a
Yeah.
why does all the bullying go one way?
I mean, there are so many different answers to that, and like I think they all reinforce each other. And one of them is because this is a linguistic movement, and there is no sense in which Leah Thomas is a woman except that you say he is. You must silence.
That's
people.
true, except for all the things where none of that made sense. But other than that, yeah.
The only way in which you can keep the fiction going. If people can say what they see in front
Only
of
way
them.
in which he can keep the fiction going. But why does he have these?
Whoa, Dawkins, my man, what happened? You said you were comfortable correctly gendering somebody just out of politeness. What happened to you he-himing Leah Thomas? What's that about, buddy? Maybe it's like you're lying about that too. But no, we're not bigots.
Better than the countesses
Yes.
who
I mean, you can't ignore the fact that this is for the benefit of men.
It's not,
You know?
because so that's another thing. Transphobes act like the only trans people are trans women. Trans men exist. That's also a thing, and they get just as mad about them existing. Look at Elliot Page. A lot of people got mad about that guy, even though all he did was be himself. I guess that's not true. He was also awesome. That's another thing he did was be awesome. So I guess there's that. But like no, like it's not for the benefit of men. It's for the benefit of trans people who would like to live authentic lives, and you're getting in the way of that.
Like, female sports has always been fifth rate. Like, it gets much less funding. You know, these girls are told things that nobody would tell a male athlete, like that, it's for the joy of taking part. Why do you care about winning?
When I did sports as I was younger, I was actively told the same thing. I don't know what the fuck she's on about.
I think in America it's become so associated with the very, very polarized political system. So and everyone tends to take their political opinions as a package. That's not an American fault solely. But in America, it's so polarized that they're really very specific packages. And if you want not to take the opinion that gender identity trumps sex, then you're a Republican, you have to be a conservative Christian, you have to be anti-abortion, you have to think that women belong in the...
No, so she chafes at this, but the people in her movement are on board with this. Like Posey Parker, most notably, even J.K. Rowling has been like, they've been like okay with siding with people who are opposed to abortion, just so they can get more anti-trans allies. They will sacrifice everything for this one bigotry that they're obsessed with. So yeah, I don't know what to tell you. If you don't like it, stop being like that.
kitchen, And so if you don't want those things, well, you've got to come over here and give up women's sports and say that men can be
Give
women
up
and
women's
say that,
sports. Like, first of all, no one's giving up women's sports. If anything, more women are participating because now trans women are in it. But
can be a
God,
female penis and so on.
and you also did not give a shit about women's sports before that. You even admitted it's always been fifth rate. Like.
And then, I mean, there's a sort of an evolutionary point to make here. Like sometimes when you look at a giraffe or a platypus or something and you say, how did this come to be? You could answer that by sort of going back. I mean, I think you did this in your beautiful book. Which one was it? The one where you go back in the Tree of Life backwards, quite thick one.
Oh, the Ancestor's Tale.
That's lovely. Yes, that book. So you can go back and you can actually answer that question, or you can just say, look, that's how evolution works. Yeah. So we have.
What is she even
this is
on
an
about
emerging ideology. Some would say neo-religion. And out of the many, many bizarre
it's not a
things
religion,
that
but
people
notice
could
the
believe,
castigation.
this is the one that made it. And you could then point at, the internet, the arrival of sex change surgery, the fact that we're all online too much, social media.
Oh, here we are, the conspiracism of how did we get here. So, like, she's acting like this is this new phenomenon, like, and like this is how we got here, or whatever. But trans people have been around for a long time. One thing that is worth noting. Rome had a trans emperor. Marcus Aurelius Antonius, born Sextus Varius Avitus Becini. Okay, whatever. Too many names. Better known by his nicknames Elagabalus and Heliogabalus, was a Roman emperor for 4 years. While he was still a teenager, his short reign was conspicuous for sex scandals. Yada yada. A close relative. Wait, where is it? Wait, where? Okay, here's the section on sexual identity. Cassius Dio states that this emperor was married 5 times, twice to the same woman. His first wife, okay, sure. Okay, all these wives. Okay. Okay, where's this? Where's the gender identity part? Was delighted in being called Heracles' mistress, wife, and queen. The emperor reportedly wore makeup and wigs, preferred to be called a lady and not a lord, and supposedly offered vast sums to any physician who could provide him with a vagina. For this reason, the emperor is seen by some writers as an early transgender figure and one of the first on record as seeking sex reassignment surgery. Trans people are not new. Even if they were, it wouldn't matter. But this isn't like a new phenomenon that the internet has created or whatever. Trans people have been around for a long time. This is just the first recorded person. It's very likely that this goes back well farther than this. And this is almost 2,000 years ago. It's 1,800 years ago, I guess. This isn't some new phenomenon. The difference now is that there's more acceptance. This would kind of like be someone acting like gay people were invented in the last century, because before that they weren't really around and now you hear about them all the time. It's because acceptance increased, because suddenly it was real. People started to realize that gay people are just normal people and people are like that and it's fine and there's nothing wrong with it, just like trans people. This isn't like an advent of the internet age.
Out adults and talk to each other without adult oversight. The cowardice of the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, which is a dreadfully corrupt organisation.
Oh, of course you have issues with it because they allowed
cheating by these German women dopers to go on in full sight for 20 years and has never sorted that out and never taken the medals away from them. They just don't care.
I like how she's on about the Olympic Committee, like, and then the thing she complains about, like, as though it had anything to do with trans people. It doesn't, right? Like, she's talking about these German women doping up or whatever. If they were trans, she would be saying German men, right? Because she's a transphobe and she doesn't correctly gender people. This has nothing to do with trans people, but as I mentioned, they've been allowed in the Olympics for 20 years, which is why she has a problem with them, but they never win anything. So maybe it's not really that much of an issue.
The show keeps on the road as far as they're concerned. So there's just all these different things that happened, and the result is what we see, as opposed to me being able to say I would have been able to predict this in advance. I'd never predicted the platypus either.
Yes, the platypus wasn't believed when it was first sent to the museum.
Well, exactly. So this is a platypus in a way.
Yes. Is there a
And like the platypus, they are trans people are very real and very normal, and it's cool that they are the way they are. And in fact, it's neat that there's some diversity in the world, like with the platypus.
tension between the LGBT?
Yes.
Is the T a little bit more? I mean, is there some opposition between the LGB on the one hand and the T on the
Well,
other?
only really
on the
from
other?
TERFs, but
I mean,
like no,
depends
not
who you
generally.
ask and depends what you think these are. If
As
you
I
think,
understand it, LGBT people in the LGBT community, whether or not they're trans, tend to have a much higher rate of trans acceptance than people who are not. Obviously, because they're marginalized in a similar way. That's why that's a coalition in the first place. Why it's not the like gay movement and the lesbian movement. They're allied in the same axis of marginalization.
these are identities, and especially if you think in American identities. So in the American way of thinking, there is the white supremacist, the cis-het white male who runs the world, and everybody else is oppressed by that person. And the more ways in which you're oppressed, kind of the better in this culture.
So no, all of this is like the fear. This now we're getting like anti-feminist talking points. This is why I agree with the position that TERFs aren't really real. They're not feminists. They're transphobes that pretend that they're feminist or cloak their transphobia in feminist language sometimes. But what she's arguing against is like this is the Milo Yiannopoulos argument. No, that's just not how things are. It's not about a person, and that person is individually oppressing people. It's just that there are axes of marginalization, which include race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, so on and so forth. Uh, and the intersection of those can lead to compounding marginalization. That's not like, oh, you get more brownie points for being more oppressed. That's just not how it is.
Sure. Then LGBTQIA
Yeah.
plus plus, all
Yes.
of those things are, you're not cis-het,
Yes.
meaning cis and heteronormative.
And by the way, I like how she's like hand waving the QIA. I stands for intersex. The people she's already been dismissive of in this conversation.
Heterosexual. On the other hand, if you actually just think that LGB is a shorthand for people who aren't heterosexual, like people who are either homosexual or bisexual, and you understand those as people who have unusual sexualities, which, has been until very recently a major reason that people have been oppressed, like as in sent to jail, given electric shocks, cast out by their family.
By the way, things that people in her camp are super on board with for trans people. Like people want them all sterilized or all eradicated from public life, whatever the fuck that means. Matt Walsh. I mean, it's genocide is what he means. Or no, sorry, that was Michael Knowles. Um. Like, yeah, okay.
These like really bad things. Then what the hell is T doing in there?
What do you mean? What the hell
Like
is he doing?
T is an identity. It's not a sexuality.
You do get that homophobes say that about homosexuality, right? You do know that, right? Like I've heard the like super Christian conversion therapy types be like, "Oh, you're no one is gay. It's just like an identity and a lifestyle." People dismiss as frivolous the things they hate constantly. You're an ally of those people. Those people go to your events. Like, oh my god.
More than that, T is an identity that undermines the very basis of sexuality.
It doesn't.
Because if you're trans, you move category, or in your mind, you move category from male to female.
Nope,
and that means
from
you
man to
change
woman.
sexuality as
Or
well.
woman to man.
So a straight man becomes a lesbian.
Yes.
And that's not very much what most lesbians find very helpful for their...
No, I mean, there's tension.
That's actually it's like the worst possible example because as I understand lesbians of the LGBT community, lesbians are the most trans accepting, except for possibly bi/pan people. But like so like it's like the worst example.
Lesbians do feel threatened, I think, don't they?
Absolutely, yes.
Well,
I mean...
TERF lesbians feel threatened, but not lesbians generally.
It works both ways, like a lot of things to do with sex. Formally it works both ways. Like a woman who identifies as a man, like a straight woman who identifies as a man, becomes a gay man. And this is increasingly popular among teenage girls, to identify as gay men.
Okay.
I think they're not going to have much success when they get older. It's not going to go very well because that's not how gay culture works.
Is it not? Oh, I'm,
But
I'm glad you have such great insight into that. You can just dismiss it. All right.
the other way round, you've got men who are bigger, stronger, more sexually aggressive. Lesbians are the people
Remember when she was like, "Oh, your sex shouldn't mean you have to be a certain way, but men are this way. This is just how men always are and have to be."
who've always found it hardest to keep their footing in the alphabet soup. Like, I have a lot of lesbian friends now doing this work, and they'll tell you that the LGB groupings never paid attention to their needs, they paid attention to gay men's needs. And so now a lesbian only group will usually find itself under pressure to admit heterosexual men who think of themselves as lesbians. And then when you add to that,
So the groups she's likely talking about are TERF groups. They're not like lesbian advocacy groups. They're anti-trans groups that, like I say, cloak their bigotry in feminist language or like LGBT language, or I guess lesbian advocacy language. And so like that's why she's describing it as like, oh, you have to admit heterosexual men as lesbians. Like, no, they're trans women. These are women who are attracted to women. It's homosexual. Like that's what that means.
that there's a very common male sexual interest, a fetish in cross-dressing, and that there are significant numbers of men who find it very sexy to think of themselves as lesbians. Probably as many of those as there
Cross-dressers are not the same as trans people. I'm just gonna.
are actual lesbians.
That should be obvious.
You're like, well, these people come into your spaces, and now it's not a lesbian space anymore.
Well, cross-dressers wouldn't be going in there. Trans women would be going in there, who are attracted to women. As I understand it, a lesbian is a woman who's attracted to a woman. So no, it is lesbians that are in there. The only part where it breaks down is your specific bigotry of insisting that trans people are not the gender with which they identify, because of a lot of the mistakes that we've already covered.
Yes. One thing that really pisses me off, it came up a moment ago, is that I've been politically on the left all my life, and I find myself now being blamed somehow. I find that people think I must be right wing because
curious
people
that
who agree with me.
Oh, that's so curious.
Tend to be politically.
That's
on the
so
right.
wild.
Really true, but
Interesting.
They often think it is.
Hmm.
I mean, do you find that?
It's so interesting.
There's a very significant.
I wonder why that might be. That, huh? And when you're transphobic, there's an associate that you're thought to be on the right. It's a mystery, really.
Movement here in the UK on the left of the women who came up through the unions and who are very good organisers, who are sex realists. And so I think here in the UK,
realists.
it's really easy to say, "Oh, look at Woman's Place UK." I mean, J.K. Rowling, look at her; she's not exactly right wing. So
she's allying with literal fascists and like anti-abortion advocate. No, she kind of is, but also she is at most a neoliberal, which, in case people are unfamiliar, neoliberalism is not terribly left wing.
It is often said, but it's an American thing to say.
Like her book defends slavery. I don't know.
Yes, that's right. I should have said that's American.
Oh, but it gets said to us too. I mean, I
Yes.
get told that I'm funded by the Heritage Foundation. That I'm
Yes.
getting money from shadowy.
You're
American groups. I'm
you
not.
stand next to Posey
It's
Parker,
a joke among the
a
women
literal
that I
fascist.
work with. People are always saying, "Have you got any of your far right money yet?" This must be stuck in the post. No, we haven't. We don't get funding from them.
No, yeah, you don't get funding from them. The people who are buying your books, definitely left-wingers, actually, yeah. Definitely not bigots on the right. Yeah, definitely not. No.
It is very irritating, and I suppose I find it less irritating because I never thought of myself as either left or right-wing.
One of these types. The faux centrism.
I've always been a very include-me-out person. Like, I've voted for every party, every one of the three main parties here. Honestly, don't know who I could vote for now. But you will find that in this.
I don't know what the third main party is that she's talking about. I'm not that familiar with UK politics. As I understand it, it's the Labour Party and the Conservative Party are like the two big ones. I don't know what the third one is. It's also parliamentary, so like third parties are like a little more viable. But like Labour is neoliberal, so center right. Conservative is right wing. So like, I'm not right wing. I just vote for right wingers. Like, I don't know what to tell
the
you.
people who are willing to speak on this issue are often people who have been through some crucible beforehand. And those can be good, bad, or indifferent things as far as I'm concerned. Lots of Brexiteers, lots of anti vaxxers,
These are the people that
lots of
she's allied
evangelical
with,
Christians,
and wonders why she's
people who
considered on the
have
right.
had some formative experience, like I think probably you sticking with atheist rationalism while the new atheist movement degenerated into gender woo. You know, you've already been cast out in some way. And if you've already been cast out, well, you've got used to it. You know what it's like, and you know that you can survive it. And so I do see a lot of very varied people who have already experienced being cast out.
Right. Well, we'd probably better come to a close. Would you like to
Yeah, I think you'd better.
tell us a bit about your organisation, Sex Matters, as we close?
Sure. So anyone who's read my book will have met Maya Forstater, who is the person I shaped the chapter about.
Maya Forstater, by the way, is like unambiguously a bigot, and that people rally around her is evidence of their dishonest natures. It's often framed like she was fired from her job for saying sex is real. What actually happened was that she was openly hostile, creating a hostile work environment for her coworkers because of this transphobia that she exhibited. And so when her contract came for renewal, they just decided against renewing it. So like the argument these people would have to have is kind of like the one I've heard from anti-vaxxers who are like, no, it should not be allowed that the company can not renew my contract. They must be forced to renew my contract because the reason why they didn't want to do that was on the axis of my making the workplace more dangerous or hostile for other people on a thing that I think is good. Like I don't know how to tell you. Like they're not obligated to renew your contract. Cry more. I don't know. Like stop being a bigot.
Britain, otherwise known as TERF Island, around TERF being trans exclusionary radical feminist, and it's what we get called for believing that sex is real.
See, there's the Motte Bailey again. She's like, oh, she's acting like sex is real is the only thing she said, but no. Notice all the things I argued. None of the things that we took disagreement with in the 45 minutes we've been watching. Not a single time was the discussion of sex is real on the table. It wasn't even mentioned. But now she's backing up like that's the position that she's taken this whole time. It's not. It never has been. It's the lie they constantly tell themselves and others.
Do tell them.
It's built into the name of her organization.
Yes.
Sex Matters.
So Maya she was a specialist in tax.
Oh, are we going to tell the origin?
Development.
The origin story?
She worked for a think tank called the Centre for Global Development, which is based in Washington, and they had an arm based in London. And at the time, in 2017, the government was thinking of changing the law to allow for gender self-ID.
Okay.
Meaning that you would be able to get a new birth certificate stating whichever sex you like.
Let's see how honestly she tells this story.
Obviously insane when you put it like that.
Oh,
but
obviously
anyway, they were about to do it, and Maya thought, but in development, sex is actually a really important variable. So, maybe we should talk about this. Maybe we should talk about our gender self-ID.
All right, 1 second. Let me find it. I was gonna let the silence be palpable here, but let me see if I can find it. I know it's accessible somewhere. I just don't. This might be it. So, Maya Forstater compiled her quote allegedly transphobic tweets into a thread. So she's done the work for us. I'm not going to characterize. I'm not going to say. I don't have to say, oh, these are the ones that we're considered transphobic and like assume these are the ones she said they are. Let's see. Let me see. Let me find it. I've got a cue for my. It was pleasant. Where are the notable ones? Bunce does not masquerade as a female. He is a man who likes to express himself part of the week by wearing a dress. I have no problem with when men wearing dresses, lies, but we don't need to confuse acting in a stereotypical feminine manner with being a woman. Or, yes, and weird he felt entitled to accept the award instead of saying, sorry, there's been a mistake. I am a man who challenges gender norms, and that credit suits didn't either. It's like they were putting the entitlement of powerful men ahead of treating women fairly. Who'd have thunk it? You think he's a part-time cross-dresser who mainly goes by the name of Philip. Let's see. Yes, I think male people are not women. I don't think being a woman or female is out of identity or womanly feelings. It is biology. People of either sex should not be constrained or discriminated against if they don't conform. Oh, that's actually not that bad. But you can go through here. There are a lot of like pretty obvious ones. Some people who believe a person with a penis can be a woman. A majority. That's also not true. Don't. Neither group should be discriminated against in everyday life, but in situations involving taking your clothes off with strangers, integration to is not possible. Showing this as the cartoon attached. It's alright. It's implying that trans women are out flashing and sexually assaulting cis women. She was openly transphobic. Like this should be enough. And there's more to it. It's hard to. Oh, pronouns are a hypnol and important. Whoops. Come on, come back here. Is an article that's highly transphobic. Sure, sometimes preferred pronouns are polite, and we can be polite when we choose. But every woman has learned from experience that politeness is exploitable and can put us in danger. Again, that implying that trans people are dangerous. It goes on. This article is the same way. So when she's like, oh, she just thought there was a concern. No, she was like openly transphobic.
Destroys the basis on which we do a lot of the work that we do. And that was fine initially with her colleagues in London, but colleagues in America, because all of this gender stuff comes from America.
Yeah, like everything else.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, it comes from America. We didn't just look up the Roman emperor who was trans. Yeah, it definitely comes from America, and what didn't happen before that.
They complained and said she was transphobic, and to cut a long story short, she lost her job. Cut a lot of the long story short. She lost her job. The implication is she was fired. She wasn't fired. They just didn't renew her contract. Are they obligated to renew her contract? Is that wrong for some reason? Should that have been disallowed for any reason? Why do they have to renew her contract if they feel she's being transphobic and making a hostile environment? Even if you think that transphobia isn't like a real concern, they thought it was. Why should they have to renew her contract? So she went to the employment tribunal and she lost.
Right. But notice also how dishonest she's being about it. She isn't going to tell you the truth of the story. She's just going to say like, oh, she was called transphobic. Well, because she was being transphobic, right? It's sometimes reasonable to call someone that. This would be akin to being like, well, she was called racist. Well, she did use the N-word a bunch. Isn't that pretty racist? Like, wasn't exactly that. But the point is, that's an analogous situation. And then saying, oh, she lost her job. Well, she just wasn't rehired, or she just didn't have her contract renewed. So what? Is that like why should she have won at the employment tribunal?
2019, that must have been end of 2020. As the book was, as I was writing the book, and in the employment tribunal, the judge James Taylor said that her belief that there are two sexes, the sexes are immutable, and sometimes recognizing that is important for women's rights. That's her belief.
No,
that was not worthy of respect in a democratic society. And so she.
Okay, so now like she's lying about the results of the thing. Like her beliefs were that trans people can't like really change their gender. Sex and gender are different things, but they back up to like the sex is real and it's immutable and yada yada. It's also not true that sex is immutable.
Deserves to lose her job. And I mean,
deserves to lose her job. No. They are not obligated to renew her contract.
The law is written, it's not just deserved to lose her job. It would mean that anyone could discriminate against her at will. They could turn her away from a bar. They could refuse to ever employ her anywhere.
So, okay, refuse to ever employ her anywhere. Why should I be obligated to employ her? Like, I mean, I'm not an employer, but why should any employer be obligated to hire her? This would be like saying, like, oh, David Duke can't find employment because everyone knows that he was in the KKK, and they don't like that. Now, too many people would be on board with that, but assuming a world where people were opposed to racism as ubiquitously as they should be, it would be like complaining about that. Why should they have to employ her?
provide her with any services, because this is the law that protects us against discrimination in employment and provision of goods and services. What he
And
was
she's
saying was
lying
that she was
openly
a
about this.
Nazi. She was literally equivalent to being a Nazi.
No, well,
or
a
somebody
bigot.
who says, we want to bring back slavery. So I knew Maya by this point, and she's a very brave woman.
Very brave.
Very dogged. So she had to go to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, which the original ruling was overturned in its entirety. I mean, the judge just didn't know what he was talking about. And that set precedent. So now the belief that sex is binary, immutable, and that matters is a protected belief in UK employment and provision of goods and
But
services.
not being trans,
Yes,
And also
that's
that's not what she was saying.
So now in a workplace, if you say, I think we need to have men's and women's toilets because there are two sexes and women need them, they can't say, you bigot.
Okay.
Yeah, and that, like, kind of a problem. Like, she's just citing a win for the racism side, right? This would be equivalent to saying, like, I think we should have whites and coloreds bathrooms because the races are separate and different, and it's an important thing for white people or whatever. Literally, you could just swap out the words, and all of it tracks exactly the same.
I've just found in your book the questions that the lawyer on behalf of the company that got rid of her asked.
Got rid of her. God damn it, Dawkins. Like, you've been, like, for the most part, pretty passive throughout this conversation, but the few times you've perked up, holy shit, they're so bad. Like, even you're on, like, furthering the lie that she was fired. Got rid of her. No, they didn't get rid of her. They chose not to renew her contract. And you're saying that, like, that should have been illegal because of her open bigotry, in a sense. Like, they didn't want to renew her contract because she was an open bigot, and you're saying, well, no, that should actually protect her from being passed over for being refused a renewed contract.
On what basis did she think male people couldn't become female? Could she name philosophers who agreed with her? I couldn't. Why philosophers? What have they got to do with this? Biologists, you want to ask?
So Dawkins, you as an atheist should probably understand this. Social concepts are different than biological ones, and gender is a social concept and a philosophical concept, not a biological one. Sex is biological, but gender is different.
How could she know someone's sex if she hadn't been present at their birth?
No, for real. That's a good question. He's acting like that's ridiculous, but for real, how would she possibly know? Literally, how could she ever know?
Doctors assign sex by looking at newborns and using guesswork.
Yeah.
So she had to answer all of those things under oath. And
I'm sure her answers were
is because the protected characteristic
absolutely
in the Equality
deranged.
Act is religion or belief, and she was claiming a belief. You can't just protect facts.
Yeah. It does say at which the room packed with women supported erupted in laughter. I'm not surprised it erupted in laughter.
Yes, and then after all of
Yeah,
that,
lots
Judge
of people
Taylor
are,
said that, you know...
well, also, they're probably not random women. They're probably, like, fellow TERFs who are standing with Maya, because that was like a movement.
Belief was a novel belief that was not protected because it was too harmful to other people's rights. So anyway, Maya set up with some lawyers, including her barrister Anya Palmer, this organisation Sex Matters, and I left The Economist to go and work for it because honestly,
because
I
now
feel
your
in
life
some ways
is
that this is
committed to this bigotry.
a generation-defining battle. Actually, because it's a battle against reality, as you said, also against free
and you're taking the fantasy side. It's kind of weird that.
speech, against women's rights, against gay people's
What
rights.
women's
and it's a
rights?
battle
What
to
gay
keep
rights?
children
Hold on. What rights are being attacked from women and gay people? None. This is the first you've even hinted at that, but you're just like, yeah, that's definitely
from
true.
being
Yeah.
indoctrinated, because children are being lied to. All of them. They're being lied to about their bodies, about
They're
human
not.
nature, about sexuality, and they're being misled, all of them, and for some of them that's leading them to
That's
a path
what,
to
that's
sterility.
what bothers me most, I must
Yeah,
say.
me too.
Well, thank you very much, Helen. Once again, Helen's book is...
All right, I'm not going to listen to the last 2 seconds where he shows the book. This was some hot garbage. I expected... Okay, so obviously we got into this with the idea that we're going to, like, listen to Dawkins be deranged about trans people. As it turns out, it ended up being mostly about this Helen Joyce person who I hadn't heard speak before. I had heard of her in some related stuff, but I hadn't heard her talk specifically. And, well, it ended up being more about her. And holy shit, Dawkins, the times you did say anything of note, you were shockingly ignorant and shockingly dishonest, even for your worst days. Yeah, that was pretty bad. definitely, not the great thinker in action, I would say. But yeah, this Helen Joyce person, pretty repugnant, and I hope it's clear, like, all the problems with the things she was saying. Like, I do actually really appreciate that they ended with the Maya Forstater thing, so we could see as the cap of like, oh, by the way, in case you had any thought that maybe we weren't being wildly dishonest the entire time, here's the little cap on top. Nope, we are happy with lying, happy to just completely lie about the story that was going on. Oh, she lost her job. She just didn't have her contractor, dude. She just didn't have her contract renewed. That's all. That's really all that happened. But like, that's the thing that they're getting into a fervor over, because they have to point to their oppression as though it's real, even though it's not. Because, I mean, let's be real. We all understand that someone who is victimized has some right to speak up. But ultimately, it's trans people who are being marginalized, not TERFs. TERFs are getting disproportionately platformed, and their voices reach further than they ought to, given how small their group actually is. They're just a very loud minority, whereas trans people are constantly marginalized, despite being far more of them and far more basis in how things actually work in the world, and don't lie about the events as they occur, as people like Helen Joyce are happy to constantly. So that was really interesting. I did wish there was a little bit more from Dawkins on this one, but yeah, whatever. Well, he said enough for us to take issue with him. It was mostly about this Helen Joyce person who is not so great. But thank all for everyone's for watching. We'll tomorrow we're doing some Magic content. Maybe I'll play some Arena. I'm debating whether we do more deck building or if we actually get to some playing. Maybe we've done too much deck building. We should do like a draft or something on Arena. But anyway, tomorrow is Magic Day, and sometimes I was actually thinking. Let me know what you would think. I'll ask again tomorrow when it's more of like the gamer crowd. I'm a big fan of Android Netrunner, and anyone who knows me through playing Magic has probably heard me talk about it. I haven't played it in quite a while, to the point where like 3 or 4 sets have come out since the last time I looked at it. I wonder if there'd be any interest in watching me do some Netrunner stuff on stream. So let me know in the comments or whatever. Don't forget that number there. If we bump that up to 75, we get to brewing some tea. Unlike the very good tea I had today, I still think I put a little too much lemon. I think it was like an eighth of a lemon. I need a little bit less than that, not by much, but it was very good. I appreciate it. It was a good choice. Thank you, Orwell. I guess the Brits were onto something. Even if they were woefully wrong about literally everything they said in the preceding 2.5 hours that we just watched. But as I say, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Have a good one. Bye.